Chapter 1252. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. Even though Bai Feng was still mumbling to herself, Su Ming had saved her because he was sentimental about the past. He did not pity her, and it had nothing to do with love. From a moment Bai Feng decided to use Su Ming, the two of them were destined to become strangers to each other. As his eyes sparkled, Su Ming no longer bothered with Bai Feng. Instead, black light shone on his body, and the light of extreme darkness swept through the area with him as its center. It did not spread too far, only covering the pit. At the instant the light of extreme darkness covered the area, Su Ming slowly closed his eyes, and a wisp of black smoke flew out of his body. It turned into the bald crane in the blink of an eye. It existed in the light of extreme darkness, and its body looked as if it was melting, as if it had fused with the light of extreme darkness. Mortal refinement art. Use your will to surround the supreme treasure, and your thoughts will be the path to enter this cycle of reincarnation. Su Ming lifted his hands and flung them forward. The white ring immediately appeared and floated in front of him. It was incredibly big and practically occupied the entire pit. There was a solemn look on Su Ming's face. He continuously formed seals with his hands in front of him. These seals were taught to him by the bald crane, and when Su Ming executed them, they sank into the white ring. However, the ring did not move. As it floated in the air, it did not react to the seals. Gradually, the speed at which Su Ming formed the seals with his hands became faster. About 100 breaths passed, and Su Ming's eyes flew open. He bit the tip of his tongue and coughed up a mouthful of blood. It turned into blood fog and charged towards the white ring. In an instant, it was carved deep into the white ring like a brand. The ring shuddered. It was as if Su Ming's blood had changed due to the complicated seals he had made just then, and it contained some sort of strange power that shook the white ring. However, it only shuddered for an instant before it returned to normal, and Su Ming's eyes lit up. This mortal refinement art is indeed useful. This is just the start of the first refinement, and it's already able to shake this treasure. Su Ming's eyes sparkled. All his attention was focused on his hands as he formed a seal once again. This time, he lasted for nearly 200 breaths before he coughed up another mouthful of blood. At the instant his blood touched the white ring, it started trembling once again. As it trembled, it looked as if a thread of blood was about to crawl into the white ring, but soon, the ring started showing signs of recovering. Without any hesitation, Su Ming leaped up and started swimming around the white ring. As he did so, he started forming seals with his hands. His speed became faster, and the number of seals also increased. Occasionally, he would cough up blood. Yet if anyone took a closer look, they would be able to see that every single time Su Ming coughed out blood, it would come from the same spot on the white ring. That spot was the spot where the white blood vessels had appeared previously. In just a short period of time, Su Ming's entire body was drenched in sweat. A large amount of it covered his entire body, and even with his level of cultivation, he seemed to be unable to withstand it. After all, each of the seals he formed had used up quite a large amount of his cultivation base. Each mouthful of blood he coughed up contained Su Ming's soul, as well as his heart's blood. 998 seals and 8 mouthfuls of blood. Right now, I only need one more seal and one more mouthful of blood, and I'll be able to activate the first refinement. Su Ming panted harshly, but determination appeared on his face. With a single move, he lifted his right hand and formed the 999th seal. At the instant he struck the ring, he opened his mouth and coughed up the 9th mouthful of blood. That blood instantly caught up to Su Ming's right hand, and almost at the same time, it landed on the spot where the blood vessels had appeared on the ring. Bald crane. At the same time, Su Ming immediately sent a divine thought to the bald crane in his heart. The bald crane had been prepared for a long time. At that moment, it let out a shrill cry, and its disappeared body swiftly manifested to turn into a black needle. It did not stab towards the white ring, but charged towards the center of Su Ming's brows. Su Ming did not dodge. simply allowing the black needle that was the bald crane to instantly close in on him with a sharp glare and stab into the center of his brows. Once it completely pierced through, it instantly stabbed into his brain. Su Ming immediately felt his mind roar. That roar brought with it waves of sharp pain as it reverberated in his head. As it continued echoing in his head, it grew louder until it completely replaced all of Su Ming's consciousness. At that moment, a drop of crimson blood swiftly appeared at the center of Su Ming's brows. It turned into a long arc and charged towards the spot on the white ring where the faint blood-red threads had appeared. Once they touched it, the drop of blood was absorbed by the blood-red thread as if it had melted. Immediately, the blood-red thread in the white ring looked as if it had obtained nourishment and started spreading outwards. Soon after, Su Ming's consciousness scattered. His mind instantly became empty, as if all his thoughts had been cut off, but soon his scattered consciousness gathered together once more. When he opened his eyes, he no longer saw the planet surrounded by the light of extreme darkness. His body was no longer in a shattered planet, but in a world Su Ming had never seen before. "Grandpa, can you give me that fish?" A pretty voice immediately reached Su Ming's ears. It seemed to instantly pull Su Ming's slightly dazed mind back to reality, causing his pupils to focus, and he saw the world before him. It was a sky with blue skies and white clouds. The land was filled with mountain ranges, and Su Ming was on a small island beside a lake. There were some villagers on the island, and Su Ming was sitting on a fishing platform with a bamboo hat over his head to shield himself from the sun. There was a fishing rod in front of him, and he was fishing. At the edge of the fishing platform made of wood was a net hanging from a wooden post. The net was lowered into the lake, and Su Ming could vaguely see a fish swimming in it. It looked as if it wanted to break free, but could not do so. Behind Su Ming was a little girl squatting on the ground. With an innocent look on her face, she pointed at the fishing net and begged Su Ming. Su Ming was momentarily stunned, then lowered his head to look at himself. He had the body of an old man. His hands were rough, but even though he was old, there were no cracks on them. Clearly, he had fished often and often touched water. He stared at the fish, then at the little girl, and a hint of understanding appeared in Su Ming's eyes. The words the bald crane had told him previously appeared in his head. It was telling Su Ming about the will of reincarnation in the mortal refinement art. The 9 cycles of reincarnation are the cycles of reincarnation between you and the supreme treasure. They might be very short, but they might also be incredibly long. In them, you will no longer be you, and the supreme treasure will no longer be the supreme treasure. It will turn into a wisp of its will and fuse with the cycle of reincarnation. During the 9 cycles of reincarnation, if you form a link of fate with it, then once the mortal refinement art ends, that link of fate will become the connection between you and the supreme treasure, and it will belong to you. This might seem simple, but in truth, there are quite a few difficulties involved. First, you must find it in the cycles of reincarnation. Only when you find it can you form a link of fate with it. Reincarnation is too mysterious for words. Very few people can understand it completely, which is why finding it in the cycles of reincarnation is the most crucial thing. If you can't find it or find it wrongly, then you will not be able to form the link of fate, and the mortal refinement art will fail. As for how you were supposed to find it, I don't know either. When the bald crane's words echoed in Su Ming's head, the little girl looked at him with a pleading expression and spoke with her young voice again. "Grandpa, this fish is so pitiful. Don't eat it. Can you get it to me?" Su Ming lifted his head slightly. Sunlight was blocked by the bamboo hat and could not fall on his face. He stared at the little girl before him, then at the fish in the net. A frown gradually formed between his brows. He could not tell whether the will formed by the supreme treasure belonged to the little girl or the fish in the first cycle of reincarnation. At the same time, in the deep pit filled with Su Ming's light of extreme darkness on the shattered planet beyond the cycle of reincarnation, the bald crane yawned. Occasionally, it would sweep its gaze past Su Ming, who was sitting cross-legged and meditating not too far away. There was a black thread at the center of Su Ming's brows that was connected to the white ring. The bald crane yawned, then looked at the floating white ring, as if it was incredibly bored. Haha, I'm a smart one. I can even remember such a powerful mortal refinement art. Looks like I was definitely not a simple person in the past. I might even be someone important. In its boredom, the bald crane began boasting about itself. This sort of boasting was the thing it loved the most. Usually, when it was bored, it would do so willingly. Speaking of me, I seem to have remembered something. There seems to be some sort of flaw in this mortal refinement art. It seems like it's very serious. The bald crane was momentarily stunned. It used its claw to scratch its bald head, then instinctively started swimming about in the light of extreme darkness. That's strange. Just what sort of flaw is it? Damn it. Why can't I remember anything? With an annoyed look on its face, the bald crane flew out of the light of extreme darkness without realizing it. It appeared outside the pit, but the instant it walked out, the bald crane widened its eyes and stared at the spot where Bai Feng had been with a dumbfounded expression. It saw Bai Feng, who had already stopped breathing, but there was a black thread at the center of her brows that was spreading into the light of extreme darkness. With a long face, the bald crane immediately flew into the light of extreme darkness through the black thread until it saw the white ring. It was connected to the white ring. Damn it, I remember now. When I refine this supreme treasure, the greatest taboo is having other people around it. It's over. If Su Ming fails, my reputation will be ruined. The bald crane's face was filled with gloom. It had a vague feeling that it could not cut off the black thread, or else it would affect Su Ming greatly and cause the refinement to fail. And once it failed, it would be practically impossible for it to attempt the refinement a second time. After all, once it was left behind, it would be very difficult to change it. The bald crane continued scratching its bald head with its claw. Suddenly, a glint appeared in its eyes, and it lifted its claw as if it was calculating something with its fingers. In just the span of a few breaths, its expression suddenly relaxed. There's a faint serendipity. Haha, since there's a serendipity in it, then even if Su Ming fails, he can't blame me for not reminding him. That's right. I intentionally didn't say anything because I wanted him to obtain a serendipity. That's right, I'm really smart, haha. The bald crane laughed smugly and began praising itself non-stop again. It's finally here. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1253. How could this be? Su Ming stared at the girl, and disbelief gradually appeared in his eyes. The girl's appearance was the exact same as Bai Feng's. She looked just like Bai Feng when she was a child, and it made Su Ming remember her when he was in Dark Mountain. Grandpa, what are you doing? I'm begging you, give me that fish. It's so pitiful. I want to let it go. Its parents must be really worried. The girl looked at Su Ming with a pleading look on her face. Her innocent eyes made it hard for anyone to refuse her. Su Ming remained silent. He turned his head sideways and cast a glance at the fish in the net. It was a very normal fish. It struggled in the net and occasionally spat out bubbles. By the looks of it, it was so tired that it was about to give up. Could it be that when I cast the mortal refinement art, Bai Feng was beside me, which was why the art also pulled her soul in? But she didn't form 999 seals like I did. The goal of those seals was to protect the existence of intelligence. But since she didn't, the soul that was pulled in has already lost its intelligence. The only thing left is her origin soul, which will change along with the cycles of life and death. Su Ming stared at the girl formed by Bai Feng's soul with a complicated look. With Su Ming's intelligence, he could already tell that the fish was formed by the White Ring's will. If he wanted to form ties of fate with it, there were two ways. One was to let it go and let it leave, but the fate of fate in this matter was rather vague, and he could not be certain. The other method was to cook it and eat it. By doing so, he could truly form ties of fate with it. If he continued with this method, then once he successfully refined the mortal refinement art, it would be the same as Su Ming completely suppressing the treasure. In silence, Su Ming cast the girl a glance and shook his head. When the girl saw him, shaking his head, tears immediately appeared in her eyes. She turned her head sideways and stared at the fish in the net. There was a reluctance to part with it on her face. Once she took a few steps forward, she lowered her head and looked at the net hanging from the pillar in the lake. "Grandpa, can I lift the rope and take a look at it again? Please." Su-ming looked at the girl and sighed in his heart, tacitly agreeing to her request. When the girl saw that Su-ming did not say anything and neither did he disagree to her request, she immediately stretched out her hand and grabbed the rope. With great difficulty, she pulled it up bit by bit until a fish slowly emerged from the net in the lake. Once it left the lake, it started struggling rapidly. In fact, when Su-ming looked at it, a fierce glare shone in its eyes. Clearly, the fish also had a simple form of intelligence. Perhaps in its eyes, even though it had been caught by Su-ming, it had been placed in the net and sunk into the lake. Besides being restricted and having no freedom, it was no different from how it usually was. However, the girl was pulling it up bit by bit and making it leave the water. This was the same as slowly taking away its life, causing a fierce glare to appear on its face. At the same time, it started struggling furiously. With great difficulty, the little girl lifted the net bit by bit. Just as she was about to lift it onto the fish platform, the fish began to struggle violently. Suddenly, a cunning look appeared in the little girl's eyes. She grabbed the bottom of the net and lifted it up. As the fish struggled, it charged out and sank into the lake with a splash, disappearing without a trace. "Thank you, Grandpa." The girl looked incredibly happy. She turned around and stood at the edge of the fish platform with her back turned towards the lake. She stuck her tongue out at Su-ming, looking incredibly adorable. "Is this your choice?" Su-ming's expression was calm, but he was sighing in his heart as he spoke languidly. Yes. The girl was incredibly happy. She felt that she had done a good deed. She let the fish go, and the fish would definitely thank her for being able to return to its parents. But just as she was happily saying that one word, before she could finish her sentence, a huge whirlpool suddenly appeared in the lake behind her. The appearance of the whirlpool was incredibly sudden, and almost at the instant it appeared, a black shadow flew out from within. That black shadow flashed in midair and grew to be about 10 feet big. It could be vaguely seen that it was a fish-shaped creature. It was so quick that it instantly closed in on the girl, who had not noticed it in the slightest. In an instant, it bit down on her and rushed into the lake from the other side of the fish platform. The girl's laughter disappeared. When she was dragged into the lake, she saw the ferocious beast that had bitten her and caused her so much pain that she almost fainted. Its appearance was the exact same as the fish she had released previously, besides its size. It was only at that moment that she saw the light in the fish's eyes. It was not gratitude, but a cold, murderous glare. When she sank into the lake and saw the murderous glare in the rain's eyes, the girl, who could no longer speak, moved her lips slightly. There was a dazed look on her face, and she mouthed a few words that Su-ming understood what she wanted to say once he saw them. Why? Su-ming saw everything that happened, but he did not stop it. This was Bai Feng's choice. When she chose to lift the net in which the fish was trapped, all of this was already set in stone. This was not the real world. It was an illusory cycle of life and death. Everything was possible in this place. Splashing sounds came from the water, and as a large amount of blood filled the air, it dyed a small part of the lake red. Su-ming looked at it quietly and closed his eyes. After a moment, when he opened them again, a fierce look appeared in his eyes, but he quietly threw the fishing rod into the lake and closed his eyes again. The sky slowly darkened, and rain gradually started falling. When Su-ming closed his eyes, the world in which he was instantly fell silent. It gradually shattered, and once it turned into countless fragments, they gathered together once more. It was as if nothing had changed, but it was as if something had changed again. Su-ming had no idea how much time had passed. When he opened his eyes, he saw a vast sky. It was drizzling, and the rain fell on the flagstones, stirring up a layer of fog that filled the county town where he was. He was no longer the old fisherman. Instead, he was dressed in a long, dark blue robe. He had the appearance of a middle-aged man, but there was already quite a lot of white in his hair. He sat on a rocking chair under the eaves and watched the rain in the sky, the pearls on the eaves, the slowly moving dark clouds, and the setting sun that was hidden by the dark clouds. It was dusk, and it was a quiet county town in the rain. The house Su Ming was in was a garden. There were quite a number of herbs planted neatly on the soil, and at that moment, the rain seemed to have nourished them quite a bit. The house was not big, and Su Ming was the only one living in it. He was a rather famous doctor in the county town. He practiced medicine to help the people, and he had saved quite a number of lives. Time trickled by, and the rain gradually became heavier. It fell on the ground, causing night to fall even earlier. The entire county town was shrouded in darkness. Only the lights in the houses were still lit, as if they were some sort of guide in the darkness, allowing the people to feel that they were not alone. Su Ming slowly stood up from the rocking chair. He could still remember that he was Su Ming, but he also noticed that his memories were not clear. It was as if Su Ming's life had been a very long time ago, so long that he was about to forget it. Is this the power of reincarnation? It's just the second time, and I'm already like this. By the looks of it, perhaps the third time, or perhaps the third time, I'll completely forget why I came here. Su Ming stood up quietly and lit the lamp on his palm. The light swayed on Su Ming's face, flickering, causing an ancient air to appear around him. At that moment, banging sounds traveled swiftly into the air. Someone was knocking on the door to the courtyard. "Dr. Mo, are you there? Please save her." Su Ming turned his head around and looked towards the door. He took a few brisk steps forward, and once he opened the door, while braving the rain, he saw two men standing outside the door. Behind them was a somewhat broken palanquin that was being carried by 8 people. The two men looked rather similar. Clearly, they were a pair of brothers. At that moment, the person on the left was looking at Su Ming anxiously. He went up and grabbed Su Ming's hand. "Dr. Mo, save me. My wife is about to give birth. Dr. Mo, save me." With an anxious look on his face, the man pulled Su Ming, intending to call out to the people carrying the palanquin behind him. "Wait, your wife is about to give birth. You should go and look for a midwife. This is—" Su Ming was momentarily stunned. At that moment, he seemed to have forgotten his previous identity. As if he had truly fused into this world, he instinctively opened his mouth and said those words. "But, Dr. Mo, this is a long story, but my wife's life is hanging by a thread. Dr. Mo, I'll kowtow to you." The man knelt down on the ground with a thump. He did not care that the water on the ground had soaked his robes to the knees. He started kowtowing with loud bangs. His eyes were bloodshot, and no one could tell whether it was tears or rain that fell from his eyes. However, he looked like a ferocious beast filled with despair, as if he would explode and kill Su Ming if he did not agree to his request. Get up first. I'll go, all right. Wait for me. I'll take the medicinal box." Su Ming hesitated for a moment, then cast a glance at the man and quickly helped him up. After a moment, Su Ming sat on the palanquin with the medicinal box and was carried away in the rain. In the distance, he could see the lights of the houses in the county under the rainy night. There was a desolate air to them as they shone. Su Ming sat in the palanquin with the medicinal box placed by his feet. He looked at the county outside the window. As the palanquin was quickly carried away, he gradually saw a shed built at the foot of the city wall, not too far in the distance. There was a noodle stall inside, and there were a few people sitting around the table eating hot noodles. At that moment, a thunderous roar traveled into the air. At the same time, a woman in the distance wept madly, while letting out shrill and forlorn cries as if she had gone mad. Feng Er, why aren't you back yet?" When the people at the noodle stall heard the shrill cries, they lifted their heads and cast a glance at each other before shaking their heads and whispering to each other. That poor girl. 3 days ago, she was dragged into the lake by a big fish." Chapter 1254. Su Ming sat in the palanquin and shook his head vigorously. He felt as if there was a layer of chaos in his mind. It was as if there was a veil covering his memories, causing Su Ming to have to spend some time to think before he could remember his past self. He watched the people in the noodle stall talking to each other outside the palanquin and the woman crying out shrilly in the rain as she gradually left into the distance. Su Ming seemed to have understood something, but when he thought about it carefully, he found that his mind was blank. In silence, he sat in the palanquin and followed the man leading the way. They slowly left into the distance until they reached a corner of the county town. There was a courtyard there. It did not take up a lot of space, but it was very exquisite. There were 2 lanterns hanging outside the door, but they had already been extinguished. They swayed in the wind and rain. Even though it was raining heavily in the courtyard, there were still quite a number of people busying themselves. However, if one were to take a closer look, one would be able to faintly see that every single person in the courtyard had fear in their eyes. Their bodies were shivering, as if they had been frightened by something. The palanquin stopped outside the house. The curtain was lifted, and the man stared at Su Ming with an anxious expression. "Dr. Mo, save my wife." Su Ming nodded and quickly walked out of the palanquin with the medicinal box in hand. As the man ran forward, he was dragged into the courtyard. But at the instant he did so, a shrill scream of pain came from the house in front of him. It was a woman's voice, and it was weak, as if there was unbearable pain in her voice. At the same time, an old woman pushed open the door of the house. There was fear on her face, and when she walked out, her body trembled as she shouted loudly, "Monster! This is a monster!" The old woman was clearly another midwife who had been invited. Almost at the moment she spoke, someone immediately went up to grab her and quickly dragged her out of the courtyard. Su Ming's footsteps came to a halt. There were tears in the eyes of the man in front of him. He turned his head around and knelt down again with a thud. "Dr. Mo, we've already invited 3 midwives. That was the 4th one just now, but all of them are like this. They keep shouting that there's a monster and refuse to continue. Please save us. Dr. Mo, I'm kowtowing to you." The man continued kowtowing, causing Su Ming to sigh softly. He did not bother himself with the man, and instead picked up the medicinal box and walked towards the house where the pregnant woman was. The moment Su Ming entered the house, he saw a woman lying on the bed. Her face was pale, and she looked as if she was about to die. At the instant Su Ming saw her, his heart trembled. The woman's appearance was that of Bai Feng. Bai Feng's stomach swelled up, and Su Ming could vaguely see the faint shadow of a huge fish on it. It was the fish Su Ming had seen during his first cycle of life and death. When Su Ming saw this scene, a bang suddenly rang out in his head. He seemed to have come to an understanding abruptly, and he also remembered the conversation between the crazed woman and the people at the noodle stall when he was in the palanquin. Reincarnation. Is this reincarnation? Reincarnation isn't a circle as I previously understood it to be. From beginning to end, it's a cycle of reincarnation. Reincarnation isn't a circle. It can be in any shape. It's a world formed by an endless number of dots. During my first cycle of life and death, I was a fisherman. I was a dot, and I personally saw Bai Feng being devoured by a fish. During my second cycle of life and death, I was no longer a fisherman. I became a doctor, but I was still in this world, but I was in another dot. This is a world, and I will become anyone in this world due to the repeated cycles of life and death. Is this reincarnation? Su Ming's heart trembled. He seemed to have come to understand it somewhat, but there was still something lacking. He felt as if there were certain parts that he could not connect. A scream of pain from the pregnant woman interrupted Su Ming's thoughts, causing his gaze to become slightly complicated when he looked at the pregnant woman. This person and the baby in her womb are clearly the manifestation of the will of the ring. If I sacrifice this woman and let the baby be born, I could form a link of fate with it, but Su Ming fell silent. He could vaguely sense the power in the cycles of life and death. It was the power of destiny. It was as if even if it was one of the countless dots in the world, the actions of that dot could change the entire world. For example, if Su Ming chose the baby, he could let it be born smoothly, but the woman would definitely die. The baby would also have no mother, and no one would know what would happen to it in the future. However, if he chose the mother, he would kill the baby. Because of that, the world would lose a dot, and because of that dot, there would be no change that would happen to this dot for all eternity. Each cycle of life and death is related to each other. There are countless changes in the story that happened in the previous cycle, and these changes will change in an unseen manner based on what I choose. For example, if the fish had not devoured the girl in the first cycle of life and death, then the woman would not have had a difficult birth, and her mother would not have gone mad in the rain. In silence, Su Ming stared at the woman's increasingly weaker presence and the baby's presence in her womb. After a long while, he lifted his right hand and swung at the woman. With it, the woman's presence swiftly became stronger, but behind it was her life swiftly flowing away. In just the span of a few breaths, a baby's cry rang out loud. A smile appeared at the corners of her lips, and she closed her eyes. She no longer breathed. The mother died, and the baby lived. Or rather, the baby was born because the mother died. With a person's death, another person could live. With the baby in his arms, Su Ming quietly pushed open the door to the room and saw an anxious man standing outside. At the instant the man saw the baby, excitement appeared on his face. He took a few steps forward, but when he saw the woman on the bed whose presence had died, his face turned pale. As he staggered, grief and indignation appeared in his eyes. He stopped moving and threw his head back to let out a shrill roar. He no longer looked at Su Ming and the baby, but instead took a step forward and arrived beside the bed. When he saw the woman who might have died, but had a motherly smile on her lips, tears fell from his eyes. "Is this your choice? Why didn't you ask me? Why?" The man turned his head around and glared at Su Ming. He did not even spare a glance at the baby in Su Ming's arms. Instead, as if he had gone mad, he roared at Su Ming. His shrill voice made Su Ming sigh softly, but at that moment, red suddenly appeared in the man's eyes. He lifted his right hand and pointed at Su Ming. With it, a great sense of danger rose in Su Ming's heart. When he turned his head around, his pupils shrank. He saw a scene he could not believe. He saw an indistinct figure appearing behind the man. That figure was incredibly weak, as if it would disappear with just a gust of wind, but the instant Su Ming saw it, his heart trembled in a manner he had never experienced before. How could this be? Su Ming mumbled. A bloody hole appeared at the center of his brows. Blood flowed out continuously, burying his life and soul. He could not dodge that finger. It was as if it was a finger of fate. At the moment Su Ming saw the shadow behind the man, he was destined to die. That shadow was Su Ming who saw himself. His body fell down slowly. At the instant Su Ming's consciousness disappeared, the entire world became still. It gradually shattered and turned into a huge vortex. In it, the fragments continued reassembling themselves. When they formed a complete world again, Su Ming opened his eyes. It was raining. The night was dark, but the lights in the area were bright. A shrill scream of pain came from the house, causing Su Ming to snap out of his daze. When he looked around, he found that he was in a courtyard house. When he looked at it, he found that it was incredibly familiar, but there was also a hint of unfamiliarity to it. However, that sense of unfamiliarity was very weak, and Su Ming could not help but ignore it. In its place was anxiety. He stared at the servants who were busy working in the courtyard, then at the figure under the light in the house. The person who was in pain was his wife. On that day, his wife was about to give birth, but it had been a long time since then. There had been 2 midwives, and each of them had run out in terror. No matter what was said, they refused to continue delivering the baby. A monster! It's a monster! The door to the house was pushed open, and an old woman ran out while trembling. Through the door, Su Ming saw his wife struggling in pain. This scene caused his heart to clench in pain. He had forgotten his past. It was as if he was supposed to be like this. He was a rather famous official in the area. He had a well-off family, a beautiful wife, and an official status. Yet right then, he could do nothing. He could only watch his wife in pain and watch the midwives tremble while calling her a monster. "Someone, bring the palanquin. We're going to look for Dr. M.O." Su Ming gritted his teeth. He remembered Dr. M.O., who had the best medical skills in the county, but for some unknown reason, he did not like him. However, at that moment, he could no longer care about anything else. When he turned around, he braved the rain and ran out of the courtyard with his servants. The group traveled in extreme speed and passed by a noodle stall in the rainy night. He did not see the old owner of the noodle stall. He was sitting there and smoking his tobacco while casting Su-ming a glance. He also did not pay any attention to the crazed woman who was shouting for Feng air in the rain. Her shrill cries in the rainy night were enough to annoy people's hearts. When they arrived outside Dr. Mo's house, he immediately went up and knocked on the door. Rain fell on his body, and it brought with it a chill, but he did not care about it at that moment. What he cared about was his wife and his child. "Is Dr. Mo here? Dr. Mo, please save her." At the instant the door opened, he grabbed the middle-aged doctor who had walked out. Anxiety appeared on his face. "Dr. Mo, save me. My wife is about to give birth. Dr. Mo, save me, tomorrow midnight." To be continued. If you like this work, please come Achidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1255. Su-ming forgot his own identity and lost his memories of the past. It was as if he believed from the bottom of his heart that he was the man whose wife was about to give birth. However, there seemed to be a hint of hesitation in the depths of his heart. That hesitation was very faint and barely noticeable, as if it was a trace that was about to be wiped off in the cycles of life and death. As the anxiety in his heart grew, that trace became fainter until even Su-ming himself forgot about it. He grabbed the doctor's arm and sent him to the palanquin. Then, without caring that the rain was getting heavier, he rushed back to his home. When he passed by the noodle stall, he still did not pay any attention to the people inside. Neither did he pay any attention to the shrill cries of the mother who had lost her child in the rain in the distance. When Su-ming returned home and waited anxiously outside his house, he had completely forgotten everything that had happened in the past. It was as if he was immortal at that moment, a husband whose wife was about to give birth. His heart was filled with anxiety, and his eyes were slightly red. That feeling of uncertainty seemed to have seized his heart as his wife screamed in pain in the house. Not long after the doctor entered the house, his wife let out a shrill scream of pain. When the door to the house was opened and Su-ming saw a baby covered in blood in the doctor's arms, like a real father, he rushed forward, intending to hug the baby, but his gaze instinctively swept towards the bed in the house. When he saw his unmoving wife, Su-ming shuddered. Grief appeared in his eyes. He ignored the doctor and the baby and walked towards the bed. As he looked at the woman who was no longer breathing but had a motherly smile on her lips, Su-ming felt as if his heart was being torn apart. He shuddered. That feeling was so real that it was as if he had experienced half of his life with this woman. "Is this your choice? Why didn't you ask me? Why?" Su-ming turned his head around swiftly and looked at the doctor holding the baby. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a hint of madness in them. He knew that there was a high possibility that only one of his wife's children could be saved due to her difficult labor. But if he had to choose, he would choose his wife without any hesitation and not the baby. But this choice was already a thing of the past. The intense pain brought about by the tearing of his heart drowned Su-ming's mind. As he laughed brokenly, a storm stirred up in his mind. As it swept past him, an indistinct memory rose in his mind. In that memory, everything seemed to be a cycle of life and death. In that memory, he was no longer himself, but had become the doctor before him. In those memories, it seemed as if choosing to be an infant was his choice to begin with. Confusion, madness, and an indescribable sadness in Su-ming's heart made him instinctively lift his hand. He had a strong feeling that he could destroy all lives with just one finger. He raised his hand and pointed at the doctor. He saw the disbelief in the doctor's eyes, and he saw a hint of understanding contained within that disbelief. That understanding seemed to have made Su-ming remember something, but it was soon filled with sadness. The doctor collapsed and breathed his last. Su-ming threw his head back and laughed brokenly. As his laughter echoed in the air, it seemed to be responding to the woman's shrill cries in the rain. On that night, the doctor was not the only one who died. The 4 midwives also lost their lives. When the next morning arrived and the rain stopped, their corpses were buried overnight. With Su Ming's status in the county, he only needed to spend a large sum of money to resolve all of this. But he had to continue living. Time trickled by, and 1 year, 3 years, 6 years, the baby girl gradually grew up and was filled with intelligence. She became an obedient little girl, but she could not obtain her father's love. Usually, when they were alone together, she would only see her father's aloof gaze. Her only companion was the son of the teacher in her home. He was a boy who was born a few months earlier than her, and they grew up together and studied together. Su Ming did not like the little girl because she was too similar to her mother. This made him remember his dead wife, and every single time it happened, his heart would ache so much that it felt as if it was about to be torn apart. He would always stare at the sky quietly on rainy days and watch the rain fall. He would watch the entire world being enveloped in a curtain of water, and without realizing it, he would remember everything that had happened on that rainy night a few years ago. One day, on a rainy night, Su Ming stared at the rain outside. When he closed his eyes, the world shattered into pieces and turned into a huge vortex. When Su Ming opened his eyes, the fragments instantly gathered together once more. He was no longer the little girl's father. Instead, he was a middle-aged man in a long robe with a scar on his face. He was a scholarly man, but because of his ugly appearance, he was repeatedly bullied by others. He had been depressed his entire life and could only work as a teacher in this county town, in the courtyard of this man with an official's name. "Sir, is it true that when people do many good deeds, the heavens will always see them?" A clear voice filled with uncertainty traveled into Su Ming's ears, causing him to lower his head and see 2 children sitting before him in the teaching house. The 2 children were about 6 or 7 years old. One of them was a boy, and the other was a girl. The one who asked the question was the little girl. There was an innocent look in her eyes as she looked at Su Ming. He only had 2 students. One of them was his son, and the other was the daughter of the famous person. He had always taught his son to be kind, to be righteous, to live his life like a pine tree, and to never give in. He had also been teaching the little girl who did not have a father's love to be independent, to not be sad, and to grow up kind. Of course, it's true. Doing good is the beginning of a person's life. If everyone does good deeds, then there will no longer be anything bad in the world. You have to remember this. Kindness comes from your heart. Doing good is not something the heavens will always see. But when you help others, you will receive a form of cleansing in your heart, Su Ming said softly with a smile. I know. Daddy, I saw someone fishing yesterday, so I begged the old fisherman to let the fish go. This is doing good, the boy immediately said, loudly with a smile. All lives in the world have spirits. You did a good deed today and saved a life. In the future, you will definitely be rewarded, Su Ming said with a smile. This time, he no longer had any memories of his past in his reincarnation. In fact, even the hint of hesitation in his heart during his previous reincarnation had disappeared without a trace. He had truly become a person of this world. Then if I see someone fishing in the future, I will also do good. The little girl seemed to be very indignant. She cast a glance at the boy and pursed her lips. Su Ming looked at the 2 children's expressions, and a smile appeared on his face. When the sun gradually began to set and he ended his lessons for the day, Su Ming went to a noodle stall in the county town alone. He sat there and asked for a bowl of hot noodle soup. The taste of the soup was pretty good. In Su Ming's memories, he always came to this place. The owner of the noodle stall was an old man with a head full of white hair. He was dressed in gray robes, and over the years, he had been personally rolling noodles in this place. Even if he was a young worker, he was just helping out. Usually, when there were few customers, the old man would smoke his tobacco and sit on a big rock by the side. He would use the grass leaves by the side to weave grass puppets and watch the passers-by. Occasionally, he would drink a few cups with the customers. His eyes were slightly murky, but every single time Su Ming looked towards the old man, he would have a very strange feeling. It was as if he could see a hint of pity in the old man's eyes, along with the anguish behind that pity. It had been like this for many years, but Su Ming did not ask about it. He liked this place. He liked sitting there and drinking hot soup while looking at the passers-by outside and thinking about his life. On this day, when Su Ming put down the bowl and lifted his head, he saw the old man staring at him, just like usual. Su Ming remained silent for a moment before he suddenly spoke. "Old man, why do you always look at me? It's not just 1 or 2 days. It's been like this ever since I came here. I'm not the one looking at you. You're the one looking at yourself." The old man tapped his tobacco pipe on the ground. As he smiled, there was a profound meaning behind his words. Su Ming looked at the old man and thought about it for a moment. He did not understand the meaning behind his words, so he shook his head. "You don't understand, do you? Heh. I'm watching you. When will you stop coming here? And when will another you come?" Su Ming frowned. Just as he was about to speak, he heard the old man mumbling to himself. "The fisherman always comes to my place because I buy his fish every day. This way, the noodle soup will have a fresh taste. Not all children are kind. Only those who are taught the path of kindness will try to persuade the fisherman to let go of the fish he caught. There is a Tao in heaven, and there is a Tao in Tao. If the child was not snatched away by the big fish, the squire's wife would not have been forced to give birth to a child. Because of that, the doctor would still be a doctor, and he would not die. The squire would still be a squire, and he would not stop loving his son. Because of that, he would not have the teacher teach his son. Instead, he would teach his son himself. Perhaps he would not be talking about doing kindness, and he would not try to persuade the fisherman to let go of the fish. Because of that, the teacher would not be around, and his son would not be around. When Su Ming heard this, his heart trembled. He suddenly stood up and stared at the old man blankly. He felt as if something in his mind had cracked. But at that moment, the old man sighed softly and looked at Su Ming with a complicated gaze. When he looked at him, Su Ming felt as if he was looking at himself in a bronze mirror. "It's not time for you to understand yet. Go. The old man shook his head and tapped the opium pipe in his hand on the ground. Immediately, a bang rang out in Su Ming's mind. The world he saw shattered at that instant, and the entire world turned into a gigantic vortex. The vortex rotated with loud, rumbling sounds, and in just an instant, the shattered fragments of the world gathered together once again to turn into another picture. It turned into a different life cycle in the same world. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1256. She was a little girl whose mother had died and who had no father's love. Ever since she was young, she had never seen her father smile. She had never felt any love from him. From a moment she could remember, she had to cover herself with a blanket at night. During the day, she had to be careful to avoid her father's house, because if she ran into him, she would see his cold gaze. The coldness in that gaze seemed to be blaming her for not dying. Even though she was still a child, she understood she had no friends. She only had the teacher's son, whom she had grown up with. He was her childhood friend. If there was another person, it would probably be that teacher. He had taught her to do good deeds and to study. He had taken on everything that her father should have done. As she grew up, she stopped crying at night. That was because she knew why her father did not like her. She had caused her mother's death. She was the cause of all of this. She rarely left her courtyard. She didn't want to go out, because every time she did, her father would look at her with a venomous gaze. That venomous gaze seemed to be questioning why she came back. Why? Didn't she die outside? Having lived in such an environment since she was young, she was very afraid. She was very timid. But today, she decided to go out. Yesterday, in the teacher's class, she had heard that saving a life was an act of kindness. She wanted to be like her childhood friend. She wanted to go to the fisherman and beg him to let the fish go. That was why, even though the sky was covered with dark clouds, and it seemed that there would be days of heavy rain later, she still sneaked out. She went to the fish platform by the lake and saw the fisherman sitting there. There was a fishing net hanging from the pillar next to him, and a large fish was struggling in the lake. "Grandpa, can you give me that fish?" The little girl asked softly to the fisherman, who had his back to her. "It's so pitiful. Don't eat it. Please give it to me." let it go home," the little girl begged. The fisherman turned around. He was an old man with a kind face. He looked at the little girl and smiled. "You bunch of kids, a few days ago, there was a little guy who came begging to let the fish go. Today, you're here as well. But if the fish is let go, I still have to live." The old fisherman smiled as he retrieved his fishing rod. After placing the bait on it, he cast it into the lake. "Grandpa, the one you're talking about is my brother. You told him to let the fish go before, so promise me today. It's very pitiful, and its parents must be very worried." The little girl took a few steps forward and looked down at the fish in the net beside the pillar. "Who said I let him go?" When the little kid saw that I didn't agree, he ran away, the fisherman said with a smile. The little girl was stunned, but determination appeared on her face. Behind the fisherman, she lifted her little hand and knocked on his back, looking very cute. "Grandpa, I beg you." Time passed slowly. The little girl's begging lasted for more than 2 hours. The fisherman smiled and shook his head with a helpless expression. He got up and walked to the pillar where the fishing net was hung. He opened the fishing net and swung it. Immediately, the fish swam into the lake. With a flash, they dove into the water and disappeared without a trace. "All right, let it go. That should be enough, right?" The fisherman smiled and patted the little girl's head. As the little girl beamed with joy, he turned around and continued to fish. A happy smile appeared on the little girl's face. With a tinkling laugh, she ran away. She was so young, so she didn't know that when she left, the fisherman suddenly raised his fishing rod. She didn't know if it was the fish that had just been released, or if it was another one. But in any case, another big fish was caught and placed in the same net before hanging on the pole again. The little girl ran back to the county excitedly. When she passed by a noodle stall, she did not notice that there was an old man sitting on a boulder there. He was watching the little girl leave with a complicated look in his eyes. He gently tapped his pipe on the ground. With that tap, the little girl, who had already run away, suddenly stopped. She saw the world before her eyes shatter and turn into a vortex that fused with her body. After an unknown amount of time, when the fragments in the vortex gathered together again, it became a deep lake. The fish swam in the lake. The lake was very deep, and no one knew where it led to. The fish swayed in the water and swam back and forth as if it had no consciousness. It was a fish that had lived in the lake for who knew how many years. It did not have too many memories. If it did have any, then perhaps it would only be the span of 7 breaths. It only remembered what happened in the span of 7 breaths. Everything else was a blank. Day after day, year after year, it swam in the lake. Sometimes it would come out of the water and look at the wind, flowers, snow, and moon outside, watching the passing of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. There were times when it wanted to rush out of the water and look at the sky and the earth outside. However, the moment this thought appeared, before it could act, it would already become a memory. After more than 7 breaths, it forgot about it. It only had memories of the span of 7 breaths, so it did not know what sorrow was, nor did it know what happiness was. 7 breaths was too short, so short that even if it was sad, it would only last for 7 breaths at most before it forgot why it was sad. Even if it was fast, it would only last for 7 breaths at most before it forgot why it was happy. Therefore, most of the time, its mind was blank. It had no memories, no thoughts. It only instinctively swam in the lake, looked at its companions, looked at the darkness, and looked into the distance where there was no future. Then, one day, it saw a fish bait sinking into the lake. It knew what it was, but it still went forward and bit it. When its body was caught by the hook and flung up, it saw the blue sky and the world outside the lake. Unfortunately, its memories only lasted for 7 breaths. When it was caught in a net and hung on a pillar, it could only struggle in the water, but it could only struggle for 7 breaths at most because it forgot that it was being fished up by someone else. It also forgot that the lake it was in should not be the size of a square inch, and that there should not be a net that it could not escape from. That was why it swam leisurely in the net. When the net was lifted off the surface of the water, it continued to struggle and suffocate. Then it saw a little girl. That little girl was lifting the net, and she was the culprit behind the discomfort felt. It glared at the little girl fiercely as it continued to struggle, and as time passed, it forgot why the little girl had lifted the net it was on. It only remembered that the little girl was the one who had caused it to feel so uncomfortable. This memory might only last for 7 breaths, but when it broke free from the hole in the net, it forgot that it had been fished out of the lake by someone. It forgot that it had been caught in a net, and it forgot that the net was not its home. It only remembered the pain the little girl had brought it during the first breath of its memory. That was why, when it returned to the water, it leaped up again. It did not know why its body could instantly grow bigger, and it dragged the little girl into the lake with one bite. Time seemed to pass slowly again. It would never know how much time had passed. Perhaps it was only the span of 7 breaths, but in any case, at that moment, it saw the fish hook hanging down from the lake again. It forgot about the danger of the fish hook, but it also seemed to know what it was. When it bit down on it again, it was fished out of the water again, and it was thrown into the net once more. When it was released into the limited amount of water in the lake, just like before, it forgot the beginning of the story and only remembered the ending. This time, it did not see the little girl. Instead, after an unknown amount of time, at the moment the net was opened, it swam out of the net and returned to the surface of the lake. It looked at the old man standing on the fish platform, and beside him, the little girl who seemed to be looking at it. It watched the girl disappear into the distance. After 7 breaths of time had passed, it began to swim about in the lake. However, this time, it seemed to be trying very hard to think of something. Eventually, it bit down on the hook and was pulled out again. Moonlight fell, and it left the surface of the water. It forgot how it had started and forgot how it ended. It was carried by the fisherman to a noodle stall. It was at this point that it opened its eyes. Looking through the net, it saw an old man holding a tobacco pipe and weaving a grass puppet out of leaves. The old man was looking at it. "You are the 6th version of myself that I see." Those were the old man's words. There was an ancient tone to his words, and he spoke them slowly. He spoke them slowly for a total of 7 breaths, allowing the fish to hear them in their entirety. His words became an eternal memory in its memory, and they turned into a bang, as if it had remembered something. Then the entire world in the fish's eyes crumbled. The crumbling fragments turned into a vortex, and as it charged forward, it took away the last of the fish's consciousness. It could not see the fragments reassembling themselves, and it could not see a world appearing before its eyes again. Zhang Wenzhang was his name. It might seem very vulgar, but in truth, there was a hint of charm to it. It was a name his father had given him, and, as the son of a teacher, Zhang Wenzhang felt that it was not a bad name. At the very least, from the name alone, it was clear that he was a scholar. But in truth, he did not really like reading. What he liked was to make delicious food with his own hands, such as boiling soup or making noodles. Perhaps it was because of this hobby that as he gradually grew up, he no longer looked as weak as his name suggested. Instead, he became a slightly plump young man. His round face looked rather simple and honest, but the light that would occasionally shine in his eyes would allow others to see that he was a little clever. But that was all. After all, the cleverness that could be seen by others was usually shown on purpose. It was a form of pride that did not want others to think that he was not clever. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 12:57. Although he didn't like studying, as the son of a teacher, Zhang Wenzhang felt that he should be able to speak eloquently. However, he felt that it would be difficult for him to do so, so he listened to the advice of the beautiful woman who had grown up with him, the daughter of his boss, whom he liked very much. He began to pretend to be deep in thought. Whether it was when he was sleeping, eating, or walking, no matter what he was doing, he would pretend to be deep in thought. This was the method that the woman he had liked since he was young had taught him. She wanted him to think often, so that others would think that he was knowledgeable. Zhang Wenzhang used this method to its fullest extent. Gradually, as he grew up, he changed from pretending to be deep in thought to actually thinking. In fact, on the day he married the woman he liked, he began to think about life under the envious gazes of the people around him. Even when he bowed to the heavens and earth, the woman angrily dragged him away, and he reluctantly bowed to the heavens and earth. He was very lucky because the woman he liked had a father who didn't like her. Therefore, this marriage, which was clearly a mismatch between their statuses, was completely ignored by the woman's father. In fact, he didn't even show up. This luck seemed to be with him. As he thought about life, he slowly seemed to understand something, but when he thought about it carefully, he realized that he didn't understand anything. Time passed slowly. In the summer of the second year after they got married, on a rainy night, his wife was about to give birth. That night, his father-in-law, the woman's father, threw his head back and laughed as if he had gone mad. He didn't care that the rain was drenching him, and his laughter echoed in the air, filled with sorrow. Zhang Wenjiang looked at his father-in-law in the rain, at the crazed look on his face. He sank into thought, but this time his thoughts only lasted for a brief moment before they were interrupted by his distraught mind. That was because his wife's shrill scream could be heard coming from inside the room. It was the sound of the pain of a difficult labor. The sound caused his heart to tremble, and he couldn't think about life anymore. In fact, he even felt fear. He was afraid that this day would be the day they parted forever. He was afraid that after this day passed, he would become as crazy as his father-in-law. As his wife's screams continued to ring out and his father-in-law's laughter grew louder in the rain, Zhang Wenjiang's body trembled. At that moment, the door to the room where his wife was about to give birth was pushed open. The midwife who had come to deliver the baby ran out with a terrified expression. "Monster, monster!" Zhang Wenjiang's heart trembled. He rushed out of the house and looked into the room where his wife was giving birth. After seeing her pained expression, he called for the people around him to lift the sedan chair and rush out of the courtyard with him. He wanted to hire a doctor, not a midwife. He had a strong premonition that this labor might be a matter of life and death. This was no longer something that a midwife could help with. Only a doctor could save a life. Braving the rain, Zhang Wenjiang walked past the noodle stall that still existed even in the heavy rain. He didn't notice that the old man sitting on the big rock in the noodle stall was looking at him. Zhang Wenjiang quickly led his men past the stall. When he arrived at the city, he found a doctor who seemed to be about the same level as Dr. Mo. Once the doctor brought him back to the courtyard, Zhang Wenjiang looked anxiously at the room where his wife was about to give birth. He suddenly gritted his teeth, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. He didn't want to wait outside. He wanted to go inside, hold his wife's hand, and get through this difficult situation with her. But at the instant he was about to push the door open, it was also open from the inside. As lightning roared, he saw the baby in the doctor's arms, and he also saw his wife's motionless body lying on the bed. It was as if she had stopped breathing. His mind roared, and he could still hear his father-in-law's shrill laughter. His body trembled, and he walked over to his wife. When he saw her pale face, she looked like a corpse, but there was still a motherly smile on her lips. His heart felt as if it was being torn apart. At that moment, he could no longer think about life. Instead, he turned around and glared at the doctor. His body turned illusory without him realizing it. It was as if another figure was slowly condensing in front of him. The doctor who was looking at him had an expression of disbelief, but he also seemed to have gained some sort of understanding. Zhang Wenjiang did not know that this scene was practically the same as what his father-in-law had experienced in the past. However, the difference was that in the past, an illusion had appeared behind his father-in-law, and right then, Zhang Wenjiang himself had turned into an illusion, and the one in front of him was a body that had manifested itself. It was also at that moment that a loud bang suddenly rang out in Zhang Wenjiang's mind. It was as if some memory that had been sealed away had suddenly been unlocked. At the instant it was activated, he felt as if he had woken up from the cycles of reincarnation and opened his eyes from deep sleep. Gradually, there was no longer any madness in his eyes, but they became clear. He looked no different from before, but he seemed to have gained some form of intelligence. He closed his eyes. As his memories were activated and he woke up from the cycles of reincarnation, he remembered everything. He was not Zhang Wenjiang, but Su Ming. He was true Morning Dao World Su Ming. He was the Abyss Builder's Su Ming. He was the Su Ming who had set up the mortal refinement art on a broken planet to refine the White Ring. He remembered everything, but he could not remember the cycles of reincarnation he had gone through. His memories seemed to have stopped at the moment he stepped into the cycle of reincarnation for the mortal refinement art. In silence, Su Ming turned his head around and cast a glance at the woman's body on the bed. He saw her face, and at the instant he did so, he shuddered slightly. The woman's face was that of Bai Feng in his memories, or perhaps it was that of Dark Mountains Bai Ling. This is reincarnation. She's my wife. In silence, Su Ming lifted his right hand and tapped Bai Ling's body gently. Immediately, a wave of life force surged into her body, causing her life, which was about to fade away, to recover. She slowly opened her eyes. She stared at Su Ming, and a smile bloomed on her frail face. "Let me take a look at the child," Su Ming stared at Bai Ling. Now that his memories had awakened, complicated emotions rose in his heart, but he did not show them on his face. Instead, he nodded and took the baby from the doctor's arms before coming to Bai Ling's side. The two of them stared at the baby together, and the smile on Bai Ling's face was filled with motherly love. "He looks quite like you. Please don't be like you and always be silly," Bai Ling said with a smile, but there was still a hint of weakness in her smile. Su Ming closed his eyes to hide the complicated emotions in them, and he sighed in his heart. Time passed. In the blink of an eye, 3 years passed. During the 3 years, Su Ming stayed by Bai Ling's side. He no longer thought about life, because there was no longer anything for him to think about. It was a cycle of life and death, an illusory life. In it, everyone was asleep, and only Su Ming was awake. He watched the people's emotions, watched Bai Ling's gentleness towards him, watched the child gradually grow up, and his thoughts could not be described with words. Sometimes, waking up was a form of pain. If Su Ming did not remember everything, he could live happily as he did in the past. But right then, he wanted to do it. But because he knew that all of it was fake, he could not throw himself into it wholeheartedly. 3 years later, Bai Ling's father closed his eyes and left the world. Another 3 years passed, and Su Ming's father in this cycle of life and death, the teacher, also reached the end of his life. His life left his body. Birth, aging, illness, and death were normal occurrences in the world. The noodle stall in the past was no longer around. It was empty, as if it had vanished without a trace during the passage of time. When the child gradually grew up, wrinkles appeared on Bai Ling's face, and an ancient air appeared on Su Ming's body. The two of them moved further and further away in the cycle of life and death without their knowledge. Bai Ling was happy. Even if she had grown old, every single time she looked at Su Ming, gentleness would appear in her eyes. When she whispered to him, she would talk about their childhood in the cycle of life and death, and how they had accompanied each other since they were young. Su Ming gradually stopped himself from thinking about the past and immersed himself in the cycle of life and death. As they counted the white hairs on each other's heads, they slowly grew old. Then, their daughter married someone else, and time was merciless. Dozens of years passed, and Bai Ling slowly grew old. More wrinkles appeared on her face, and on a certain midnight, she held Su Ming's hand and looked at the starry sky outside the window, while mumbling softly, "I had a dream. I dreamed of a mountain and an ancient tribe. I dreamed that I was a woman from a tribe and dressed in white fur. There were some pretty decorations at the center of my brows, and you were a member of another tribe. On a blood moon, you carried me on your back and ran in circles around a mountain during dawn. You did not want to send me back. I dreamed of a promise between you and me." Bai Ling mumbled with a smile at the corners of her lips. She did not finish her words. When they turned into murmurs, she closed her eyes and never opened them again. Su Ming held Bai Ling's hand. Nostalgia appeared in his eyes as he watched Bai Ling's life gradually fade away. He watched the entire world go through what seemed to be a cycle of 60 years. A year later, Su Ming sold the courtyard house because there was no longer anyone there who was the person in his memories. As time passed, he became the oldest person in the county city. He had witnessed all the changes that had happened in the county city during the 60 years. He had seen far too many people live grow old, get sick, and die. Hence, he sold his property and built a platform in an empty spot in the county city. Then, he set up a noodle stall there. He cooked noodles, boiled soup, weaved grass puppets, watched life, and counted the cycles of life and death. Tomorrow, I will continue with the third chapter, to be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1258. In a vast galaxy in true Morning Dao world, the whirlwind had been howling for more than 10 months. Fortunately, it did not continue growing stronger, but it had never weakened either. It continued sweeping through the galaxy, intending to destroy all signs of life. 10 months was not a long period of time, even to a mortal, but to the cultivators who could move through the galaxy at their beck and call, it was a very long time. They could not leave their shelters too far away, so they could not know what was happening in the world outside. They could not contact their fellow Taoists they were familiar with. It was as if they were trapped in a land of despair. They could only stare at the whirlwind in the galaxy and wait quietly for the day when it would disappear on its own. However, there were also some cultivators who relied on their great power and continued researching the whirlwind during the 10 months. Gradually, they found some indistinct patterns. Based on the patterns of the whirlwind, they could venture slightly further away to search for their companions who were still alive, or perhaps they could take advantage of the situation to rob them. In a place not too far away from the planet where Su Ming meditated were 13 huge meteors charging through the whirlwind. As they rubbed against each other in the whirlwind, they shrank at a speed visible to the naked eye. By the looks of it, in at most 3 days, they would be crushed by the wind. And that was because the power of cultivation was continuously spreading out from the meteors to negate the power of the world in the whirlwind. Otherwise, they would have been crushed even faster. Each of the 13 shooting stars was hollow, and there were 3 cultivators sitting cross-legged and meditating in each one. Their clothes were rather extravagant, and they did not look disheveled. After all, it had been 10 months. True Morning Dao world might have been reduced to ruins, but as cultivators, they did not care too much about it. Aside from the 3 cultivators sitting cross-legged on each of the 13 meteors, there were also dozens of cultivators around them. Their auras were weak, and their bodies were nailed to the walls of the meteors. Their minds were clear, but their cultivation bases had been nailed to the meteors by someone in a strange way. They had clearly been treated as living spirit stones, and they were continuously releasing their cultivation bases to fuse with the meteors to fight against the whirlwind in the world outside. Based on the clues Old Monster sent us a few months ago, there's a planet that is rather well-preserved 3 days away from here. There are ripples of cultivation bases spreading out from there. There were 3 people sitting cross-legged on one of the 13 meteors. One of them, a middle-aged man, opened his eyes and revealed a ferocious smile as he slowly spoke. Let's hope that we'll have a good harvest this time. If we run into someone from Morning Dao sect. The third person among the 3 was an old man. He opened his eyes, and when he spoke calmly, he cast his gaze towards the last person among the 3. There is no longer any distinction between sects and clans in true Morning Dao world. Kill him. His cultivation base will be used as the source to control the rune. Kill. The last person was a young man. He was dressed in a constellation robe, but based on his robe, he did not seem to belong to a direct descendant, but a branch family member. However, the young man's level of cultivation was incredibly powerful. He had already attained great completion in World Plane Realm, and with just one step, he would be able to step into Mastery Realm. Yet for some unknown reason, even though he had not reached Mastery Realm, the mighty pressure spreading out from his body made the other 2 people speak as if they were of equal status. Those 2 people were in Mastery Realm. After all, there were very few weaklings among those who could survive the disaster. Only those who possessed the power of Almighties had the right to do so. The 2 people cast each other a glance, then smiled faintly. They did not speak and closed their eyes. Time trickled by, and in the blink of an eye, 3 days went by. When the 3rd day arrived, Most of the 13 meteors had already disappeared, but they still did not crumble in the whirlwind. Instead, they turned into 13 shooting stars that charged toward the planet where Su Ming was. After a moment, booming sounds came from the planet. The powerful tremors caused the planet to tremble continuously. Quite a number of places at its edges crumbled and were swept into the galaxy. At the same time, the bald crane's eyes suddenly shone in the pit beside Su Ming, who was enveloped by the light of extreme darkness. A fierce glare appeared in its eyes, and it leaped up to rush out of the light of extreme darkness. When it cast a glance into the distance, its expression instantly changed. 1, 2, 3. Darn it all. There are hundreds of people in the 13 meteors. No, there are only 39 people with active presences. The others have all turned into puppets that control the 13 meteors to form defenses. They're like spirit stones in human bodies. This idea isn't bad. They actually thought of this method to move through the galaxy. Could it be that they came here for this place? A thought appeared in the bald crane's head, and it shrank back into the light of extreme darkness. Its body disappeared and fused with the light of extreme darkness, immediately changing the scene in the area. In the eyes of the others, it was no longer a pit, but a plain. Before long, 39 long arcs charged over from the distance. In the span of a breath, they arrived behind Su Ming's isolation grounds and floated in midair. The 39 people had cold expressions on their faces, and there was also a grim air about them. Clearly, all of them were people who had killed heinous people. 6 of them possessed the mighty pressure of almighties, and the weakest among them was in the later stage of World Plane Realm. Some of them were originally cultivators from Morning Tao sect, and some were from the Immortals Union. 10 months ago, the cultivators from both sides would have attacked and killed each other the moment they met. But at that moment, they were very harmonious. This was related to Morning Tao World's disaster and the distribution of benefits between them. Strange, it should be here. Based on the information Old Monster once sold us, it should be here. A glint appeared in the eyes of the old man, named Meow, in the first meteor. A jade slip appeared in his hand. Once he looked at it, he frowned and spoke slowly. Could it be that Old Monster once sold us fake information? Someone from the 30-something people immediately said with a cold sneer. How dare he? If he dares to sell us fake information, I will definitely find him and skin him alive. I will use his corpse oil to light a lamp and burn his soul. It can't be. Fellow Taoist, one still has a good reputation over the past few days. Even if he sells fake information, he won't sell it to us. Could it be that the people in this place have left? Did they leave or hide this place? Even if we can't find any clues with our divine senses, we won't have come in vain if we crush this planet and fuse it into our enchanted vessels. If the people in this place are truly hiding here, then when we crush this planet, they will naturally appear, the young man in the constellation robe said languidly in a dark voice. As he spoke, he lifted his right hand and seized the air. The world instantly roared, and a black long blade appeared in his hand. When that blade appeared, the world lost its color. Waves of cold air came crashing into everyone's faces, causing greed to appear in the eyes of the cultivators in the area, but there was also wariness in that greed. The Immortals Union's Freezing Saber sect cornerstone treasure, Heavenly Freezing Saber. Haha, only in your hands will this item be a fitting match. We did not kill the great sect elder of Freezing Saber sect in vain while he was in isolation while he was injured. The old man named Meow smiled faintly. Brother Meow, you praise me too much. The great sect elder of Freezing Blade sect's soul also gave you a portion of your soul, didn't you? The strength of your divine sense is already outstanding among those in the same realm as you. Also, Brother Song obtained the body of the great elder of the Cold Saber sect. After refining it, he gained another layer of refined skin. I'm afraid he's also the one with the strongest physical body among his peers. The young man in the starry robe laughed. As he spoke, he suddenly pressed his right hand down towards the ground. The ground immediately roared, and a black line appeared. As it distorted, it manifested in several more lines that intersected with each other to form a huge black net that charged towards the ground. The net was boundless and incredibly large. By the looks of it, once it landed, it would instantly crush the planet and turn it into countless shattered stones. The flatland the bald crane had manifested was located in the middle of the net. If it truly landed, then Su Ming's isolation grounds would immediately be exposed. The bald crane's transformation could hide from all divine senses, but there was a huge flaw in it. It was an illusion and not real, which was why it was fine for the naked eye and divine sense to see it. But if anyone tried to break it with brute force, they would immediately be discovered. Damn it, Su Ming still needs a few more months. Why did this group of people suddenly come here? And who is that old monster one? How did he know that there are people here? The bald crane's eyes shone in the light of extreme darkness. A dark look appeared in its eyes, and it did not dodge the descending black net. It simply allowed it to charge towards the ground. As the ground trembled, huge cracks immediately appeared. They intersected with each other and spread out with loud rumbles. In just a few howls, the planet let out a loud bang as if it was about to shatter. Yet at that moment, as the black net suddenly cut through the ground and touched the illusion the bald crane had manifested, the illusion disappeared on its own, and an endless amount of black light spread out from within it. The 30-something cultivators in the area were the first to be affected. At the instant the black light spread out, quite a number of them let out shrill screams of pain. Chilling air immediately rose in their bodies, and 4 of them, who were only in the later stage of world plane realm, plummeted to the ground. With a bang, their physical bodies turned into blocks of ice. Even their nascent divinities could not escape. The black light instantly pierced through them, and their bodies and souls were destroyed. The others were lucky enough to escape, but shock appeared on their faces. Only the 6 cultivators with the presences of almighties spread out. While they retreated, great greed appeared in their eyes. What is this light? Haha, there is indeed someone here. This person has such a powerful light, but he chose to hide it. He must be heavily injured and is currently exercising his breathing to heal himself. This is our chance. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 12:59. This light. At the instant the young man in the constellation robe saw the black light, he frowned as if he had remembered something. This is the light of extreme darkness. I saw this light in true Morning Dao world before. It was controlled by Dynast Dao Kong at that time. Could it be that Dynast Dao Kong is the one being treated here? A glint appeared in the young man's eyes, and excitement and bloodlust appeared in them. Set up the rune. The old man named Meow licked his lips and immediately roared. The 30-something people in the area immediately moved and surrounded the spot where the light of extreme darkness was spreading out from. All of them formed seals with their hands, and when the old man named Meow let out another low growl, they lifted their palms together and brought out all their power to push down on the ground. The ground trembled, and the planet rumbled. The planet, which already had countless cracks on it, seemed to be unable to withstand the impact. It shattered and fell back, layer by layer. What appeared before the people's eyes was a huge stone that was about 100,000 feet in size. Inside the stone was the pit where Su Ming was. At the same time, the 13 planets that had descended on the ground flew out and surrounded the area as if they had turned into a rune. It enveloped the area, preventing the whirlwind from surging in. As for the ones that had scattered into the area, the cultivators were not afraid of them for the time being. Almost at the instant the planet shattered and the stone was revealed, the bald crane let out a shrill howl. At the same time, the light of extreme darkness spread outwards, and shrill screams immediately came from the 30-something people. When the others retreated, 2 more cultivators turned into chunks of ice and fell into the planet. Damn it, if it wasn't because I had to split a portion of my divine sense to maintain Su Ming's land of reincarnation and couldn't mobilize too much of the light of extreme darkness, I would have killed these bastards a long time ago. If Su Ming had woken up, it would have been even easier for him to kill these people. Damn it, why are there so many of them? There are even 6 almighties among them. Teaches. This is too much. The bald crane was slightly anxious. It would have been fine if there were only a few of them, but there were so many of them. It might not be afraid, but it knew that Su Ming's mortal refinement was incredibly crucial. He could not be disturbed, or else an irreversible change would occur. Once he failed, he would no longer be able to use the same refinement method to subdue the supreme treasure. This is indeed the light of extreme darkness. If we absorb it, our combat abilities will increase by leaps and bounds. The greed in the old man, named Miao, became even stronger. Without any hesitation, he lifted his right hand and swung it forward. The galaxy instantly trembled, and as the distortions and tornadoes spread out, dozens of huge eyeballs appeared in the air around the 13 meteors. The eyeballs were bloodshot, and quite a number of them were broken, but all of them shone with a powerful light at that instant. That light gathered on the stone surrounded by the light of extreme darkness, where Su Ming had isolated himself. Those eyeballs were the eyes of the temple. At the same time they appeared, the old man, named Miao, formed a seal with both hands and pressed his hand on his chest. He coughed up a mouthful of blood, which immediately turned into blood-red marks in the air and imprinted themselves on each of the eyeballs. "Sacrifice!" he roared. Immediately, about 40-something people among the hundreds of people who were pinned to the walls of the 13 meteors started trembling violently. They were the people who originally belonged to the sacred temple in the Immortals' Union. They were the ones who had controlled the eyeballs during the battle. As they trembled and coughed up blood, it seeped through the meteors and charged towards the eyeballs. Once it fused with them, the eyeballs shone with a blood-red light. When their gazes landed on the light of extreme darkness, they seemed to possess a certain amount of penetrative power. In an instant, the light of extreme darkness became semi-transparent, allowing the people in the area to see Su Ming sitting cross-legged and meditating in the light of extreme darkness. There was also a huge ring rotating slowly above him. In fact, even the bald crane's shadow hidden in the light of extreme darkness did not show itself for an instant. Then, the dozens of eyeballs exploded at the same time. Clearly, they had used up some of their power to see through the light of extreme darkness. At the same time, the dozens of cultivators from the sacred temple also exploded. This was because Su Ming had not woken up, or else with his status as the origin of the extreme darkness. Even if there were 10 times more eyeballs, they would still not be able to see through him. After all, the bald crane was a soul and had lost too many of its memories. It only had its instincts, and it was not enough for it to use the light of extreme darkness to fight against these almighties. That's definitely a supreme treasure. I can vaguely sense its mighty pressure. That's a supreme treasure that can spread out the light of extreme darkness. It's not Dao Kong. This person's body isn't Dao Kong's, so the appearance of the light of extreme darkness is definitely due to that supreme treasure. I know, he's using that supreme treasure to heal himself. By the looks of it, he should be injured quite badly. The Almighties, including the young man in the constellation robe, immediately looked at each other and saw the greed in each other's eyes. Ha, there's a soul in the light of extreme darkness? Leave it to me, but I will need your help. Fellow Taoist Han, don't tell me you didn't bring that treasure you brought out when your army destroyed all my cultivators. An old man in a black robe with the cultivation base of an almighty laughed in a hoarse voice. His body swayed, and suddenly his physical body withered rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he was reduced to a skeleton, a layer of skin and flesh. Even his bones seemed to have melted, causing his body to scrunch up together. A wisp of black smoke flew out from the top of his head. The black smoke swayed in midair and turned into a 3-headed malicious spirit. It threw its head back and roared, and the ripples of power belonging to an almighty spread out. It was no longer a nascent divinity, but a dermic idol that had been refined and fused with the nascent divinity. As the three-headed malicious spirit roared, it charged towards the light of extreme darkness. At the same time, a middle-aged man dressed in a purple robe among the six almighties laughed coldly. He did not speak, but instead lifted his right hand and swung it forward. He immediately sat down cross-legged and meditated. Clearly, the item he swung out required his entire mind to sink into it before he could control it. Booming sounds rose into the air, and the galaxy trembled. A gigantic green log appeared in the galaxy. There was an old face on the surface of the log. However, a lot of the face had been damaged, and it looked rather indistinct. At the instant it appeared and the purple-robed man sat down, the eyes of the face on the log flew open. A freezing glare shone in them, and the log let out a bang before charging towards the light of extreme darkness where Su Ming was. At the same time, the three-headed malicious spirit laughed ferociously and rushed out behind the log as well. Damn it! This is an enchanted treasure used during large-scale battles. It's a treasure that can only be used by tens of thousands of people. But this person can actually use it? This? Darn it all. So when the sect was destroyed, they fused the souls of all their disciples into the log. Because of it, they might have had a chance to possess others and be resurrected once the disaster is over. It's a pity that they didn't entrust it to anyone, or perhaps they were killed and snatched away by someone else. The bald crane activated the light of extreme darkness at full power. With a loud whoosh, the light of extreme darkness shone outwards and crashed into the log. Booming sounds reverberated in space. The log shuddered and shattered layer by layer, but it still forced its way in and entered the light of extreme darkness. It was already incredibly close to Su Ming. Immediately after, the three-headed malicious spirit hiding behind the log threw its head back and roared. It lifted its hands to seize the light of extreme darkness, and the bald crane immediately felt a great sense of danger. It sensed its soul being sucked in by a great force, as if it was about to be dragged out of the light of extreme darkness. As it screamed, the bald crane flapped its wings, and its body changed to turn into a seven-colored peacock. As it screeched, it fought against the suction force. But at that moment, the old man named Meow, who had summoned the eye of the sacred temple, let out a cold harumph. He lifted his right hand and pushed it against the light of extreme darkness. The galaxy roared, and his palm turned into a huge seal. When it descended, it immediately started suppressing the light of extreme darkness. The young man in the sacred constellation robe formed a seal with his hands, and a freezing blade swept horizontally to cut down on the light of extreme darkness. This was the joint attack of four almighties. None of them were weaklings. They were people who could survive the disaster, and they lived very comfortably. At that moment, they attacked at the same time, and the bald crane was no match for them. It could not change the disadvantageous situation it was in, and its soul was continuously being extracted. Fellow Taoist Chun, fellow Taoist Sima, please attack. Once we obtain this supreme treasure, we can use our fated chances to understand it and see who is fated with it. No one will snatch it from the person who obtains it, or else we will work together to kill him. But the person who obtains this treasure must give some benefits to the others. A glint appeared in the old man named Meow's eyes. He spoke at a moderate pace, making it clear that he already treated the supreme treasure as theirs. Once he said those words, the man and woman who looked like a couple cast each other a glance. A glint appeared in the man's eyes, and he smiled. My fellow Taoists, none of you have used your full strength, but you still want me to attack. Clearly, you're worried that I will snatch it from you. Oh well, it's not easy for us to meet each other, and we still have plenty of things to do in the future. I will lend you a hand. As he spoke, the man lifted his right hand and pointed forward. Immediately, the power of the laws of fate appeared, and the woman by his side smiled faintly. She lifted her left hand and pressed it against the man's right hand. Immediately, a ray of white light appeared between their palms and turned into a white long sword. When it appeared, cracks immediately appeared in the galaxy, as if it could crush space itself. With one slash, sword light turned into white light that charged towards the light of extreme darkness. 6 Almighties attacked, and to the bald crane, this was an unprecedented challenge as far as it could remember. At that moment, as it was being sucked in, it threw its head back and roared. Once it had turned into a peacock, it swiftly spread its tail. The screen of feathers that spread out was not 7-colored but black. At the instant it appeared, the light of extreme darkness swept outwards as if it was boiling. To be continued. If you like this work, please come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1260. Compared to the danger the bald crane faced in the world outside, and the booming sounds brought by the 6 Almighties with the intent to plunder, the world in the cycle of life and death was calm. There was no wind, so there were no waves. There were no trees, so the leaves did not move. Everything was quiet. Only the change of seasons passed quietly, without Su Ming's knowledge, due to a law that was different from the world outside. Time passed by quickly. As Su Ming watched the sun rise and set, as well as the figures of the people, he became used to the smell of his tobacco pipe in the noodle stall. He also became used to adding fish bones into his soup so that it would be filled with a fresh taste. Almost every single day, a fisherman would bring fish to him. When he looked at the fisherman, Su Ming felt as if he was seeing himself in one of the cycles of life and death. He also felt as if he was looking at the fish that was brought to him. When the fish left the water and opened its mouth as if it was about to suffocate, Su Ming also felt as if he was going through another cycle of life and death. There was also the doctor who would never step into the noodle stall every single time he passed by. There was also the squire who had moved to the county town, and on a rainy night, the squire had brought a group of servants to carry a palanquin to take the doctor away. As he watched them, Su Ming closed his eyes. There was always a gloomy teacher in the noodle stall. He was used to drinking soup and eating noodles there, regardless of the weather. He would often bring his son, a child that looked a little smart, to this noodle stall to drink soup and eat noodles with him. Occasionally, a little girl would come over and play with the boy at the noodle stall. Their happy laughter would echo in the air, and when it fell into Su Ming's ears, every single time he looked over, it would turn into a smile at the corners of his lips. The fisherman, the little girl, the fish, the doctor, the official, the teacher, the grown-up son, the old man who makes soup and makes noodles. 8 people, 8 lives, but there are quite a number of them who have intersected with each other in their lives, and they have affected each other. When the sun set and rain gradually fell, Su Ming sat on the big stone and looked at the dark clouds in the distance while mumbling under his breath. There was understanding in his eyes, along with a hint of sentimentality. It's just like how the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Fate lies within it. This is the rise and fall of fate. It is also reincarnation. Reincarnation is formed by countless fates intersecting with each other to form a net. Every life within this net is a part of reincarnation. Su Ming sighed softly. What a mortal refinement art. This isn't sinking into the cycle of reincarnation. This is clearly the epiphany of the fate realm. It's the repeated ties of fate with the ring. These ties of fate have turned into threads that bind it layer by layer until it can no longer be untied, nor can it be separated. In that life, I was the fisherman, it was the fish, and by phone was the little girl. I fished it out of the water and formed an invisible fate with it. By phone let it go and was swallowed by it into the lake. Because of that, we also formed an affinity, and because of that, reincarnation appeared. Because of that, this was the origin of fate. In that life, I was the doctor, and it was the baby in a woman's womb. By phone was its mother. I killed by phone and took it out, and because of that, we formed an affinity. This is the fate of helping it give birth. In that life, I was the squire, and it was the baby in my wife's womb. I watched it grow up. It was by phone, and it was also the spirit of the ring. This is the fate of blood. In that life, I was the teacher, and I did good deeds, and because of that, I formed the fate of bringing it up. In that life, I was the fish, and it was the fisherman. It was as if the cycle of reincarnation had been reversed. I experienced its pain in the past, and this is the fate of empathy. Life after life passed until I tied the knot with by phone. It was my child, and this is the fate of a father in our blood. The fate between me and the ring lasted 7 lives. During my 8th life, I was an old man, and I counted my lives and watched the cycles of reincarnation in silence. There are 9 cycles of reincarnation in this mortal refinement art. I went through 8 of them, and only one was missing. Perhaps this missing life is the fall of fate. Fate rises and falls, and it is a dream of reincarnation. Su Ming shook his head. He opened his eyes and cast a glance at the world again. It was raining outside. The rain was very heavy, and it poured down with loud sounds. After watching it for a long time, just as Su Ming was about to close his eyes, he suddenly heard faint and barely discernible shrill cries in the rain. Feng, air. Feng, air. Su Ming's heart trembled, but he still closed his eyes because he understood that perhaps the missing life had always existed, but he had forgotten about it. At the instant Su Ming closed his eyes, the entire world turned into countless fragments. They swept together to form a vortex. As it rotated with loud bangs, it gradually turned into nothingness. In true Morning Tao world, the planet in which Su Ming meditated had already collapsed. Only the rock in the pit protected by the bald crane remained. It was suppressed by the 13 shooting stars around it. The light of extreme darkness where the bald crane was also attacked by the 6 almighties working together, causing the bald crane to spread out a screen of black feathers in its madness. With a whoosh, the galaxy looked as if it was about to freeze. The light of extreme darkness surrounding Su Ming swept outwards violently, and the huge log was the first to be affected. It shattered with a bang, and as it disintegrated layer by layer, it was reduced to ashes. The 3-headed malicious spirit let out shrill screams of pain and retreated swiftly. Green smoke spread out from its Dharma body, and it instantly became much weaker. When the freezing blade fell, it was sent tumbling backwards when it touched the black light. As booming sounds reverberated in space, the expression of the young man in the constellation robe changed. He staggered a few steps back, and the seal formed by the old man, named Miao, crumbled and shattered when it came into contact with the light of extreme darkness. The bald crane spread out its tail, causing the old man's pupils to shrink. Only the white sword glare spreading out from the white long swords in the couple's palms charged forward. When it touched the light of extreme darkness, it became much weaker, but it did not disappear. Instead, it turned into a thread that charged towards Su Ming, who was meditating inside. Clearly, the couple's focus was not on the bald crane or the ring, but on Su Ming. As long as they killed him, there would naturally be no more suspense in their plans. As booming sounds reverberated in space, and the bald crane spread its tail to deliver its final strike, most of the light of extreme darkness surrounding Su Ming dissipated, causing Su Ming's location and his appearance to become clearer before the people's eyes. The bald crane let out a roar, and with a bang, it returned to its original form. Weakness appeared on its face, and its soul became semi-transparent. It charged towards Su Ming, wanting to stop the white sword thread before it closed in on him. But at that moment, the 3-headed malicious spirit that was originally retreating turned around swiftly. The 6 eyes on its 3 heads glared at the bald crane, and with an indescribable speed, it instantly charged towards the bald crane. Damn it, this bald beast's soul is mine. Don't you dare snatch it from me. I'm going to devour it. I'm going to chew it to pieces bit by bit. The 3-headed malicious spirit roared. When the bald crane was about to close in on Su Ming, it could only watch helplessly as the white sword thread seeped into the center of Su Ming's brows with a bang. The 3-headed malicious spirit behind it had already caught up to it. It lifted its ghost claw, and with a ferocious smile, it struck the bald crane. The other people in the area also rushed forward at that instant. At that instant, a faint voice echoed in all directions. That voice was not loud, but the moment it appeared, it caused the hearts of all the people in the area to tremble. Who gave you the right to do so? At the instant these words were spoken, Su Ming opened his eyes. There was an ancient look left behind by the cycles of life and death in his eyes, along with a freezing glare that could make the world submit to him, and a domineering presence that could make the galaxy tremble and the universe submit to him. An endless amount of malicious aura also appeared on Su Ming's body. When it fused with his appearance, it made him feel as if he had turned into a gigantic mass of chaos. That chaos could absorb all the wills of the world, and the will of stillness in Su Ming's body erupted without holding anything back. He lifted his right hand and seized the air. Immediately, the three-headed malicious spirit with the power of an almighty was unable to fight back. Fear and shock appeared in its eyes, and its dermic idol disappeared, but in the next instant, it automatically appeared in Su Ming's hand. Su Ming pierced through its body and seized the heart of the dermic idol in its body. "It's you." Su Ming swept his gaze across the area, and the first person he saw was the young man in the constellation robe. The young man's face instantly turned pale, and a bang went off in his head. He staggered a few steps back and coughed up a mouthful of blood. His heart was in great shock, and he instinctively shook his head. It was as if he did not shake his head quickly and dare to nod. Then with just one thought, Su Ming could make him break down 1,000,000 times. "Then it's you?" Su Ming looked toward the old man, named Miao. The old man's face was stark pale, and he was shuddering. He could sense an unprecedented fear from Su Ming. It was as if the other party was the universe, and at that moment, with an aloof and merciless air, the universe wanted to destroy all lives. And he was just a tiny ant under the universe's wrath. "Then it's you," Su Ming said flatly. At the instant he spoke, the white ring on the top of his head swayed, and a ripple spread out in a very casual manner. It disappeared in an instant, and when it reappeared, it was already in front of the purple-robed man who had cast the huge log. Terror appeared on the man's face, but before he could say anything, the ripple shot through his body, taking with it the man's shattered body and scattered soul. At the same time his body shattered, Su Ming slowly squeezed his right hand and crushed the heart of the person with the aspect of Dharma. With a bang, his entire body turned into a ball of fog, and Su Ming flung it into the bald crane's mouth. "Chew it slowly. I didn't disperse his soul. I want to chew it to pieces bit by bit." When Su Ming said those words flatly, excitement and agitation appeared in the bald crane's eyes. It opened its mouth wide and used its claws to shove the fog formed by the soul of the person with the aspect of Dharma into its mouth. As expected, it began to chew it bit by bit. Shrill screams of pain rang out, causing the hearts of all the people in the area to tremble. During that instant, their gazes when they looked towards Su Ming were filled with terror, as if they were looking at an ancient fiend that could shake the universe. "Run." This was the only thought that appeared in the minds of the remaining four almighties and the 20-something people in the area at that moment. Begging for recommendation votes, begging for monthly votes, because tomorrow I want to try the title that has not appeared in everyone's eyes for a long time. Everyone, do you want to vote for monthly votes for these 3 words? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1261. Run. They had no choice but to run. The strength Su Ming displayed, especially the casual manner in which he killed a person, caused the hearts of all the people in the area to tremble violently. At that moment, as they fled in all directions, their faces were pale, and they had already erupted with their full strength. The young man in the constellation robe turned into a star. He was so fast that he instantly charged towards one of the 13 meteors around him. Miaoxing's body also moved. Distortions appeared around him, and as he moved, he became even faster. The pupils of the couple shrank, and they turned into 2 rays of sword light that charged into the distance. The 20-something cultivators around them could not compare to the Almighties in terms of speed or reaction speed. Even though they were retreating at that moment, it was clear that they were much slower. "You disturbed my meditation and startled my companion. How can I let you leave just like that? Su Ming said flatly. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. His body instantly broke through space and appeared behind Miao Xing. He lifted his right hand and struck him lightly. Miao Xing's expression changed drastically. He knew that it would be difficult for him to escape from this disaster. Madness appeared in his eyes, and it was clear that he was going to risk everything. The old man, named Miao Xing, naturally had a trump card for being able to survive the disaster and still be very free and unfettered. Almost at the instant, he turned around to look at Su Ming and decided to risk everything. Miao Xing let out a low roar. He lifted his hands and pushed them against the air before bringing them down swiftly on Su Ming. Life and death. Along with his voice, an iron book appeared in the left hand of the old man, surnamed Miao. At the same time, a black wooden brush appeared in his right hand. Su Ming had seen this set of enchanted treasures before. At the instant the old man brought them out, he roared again. Your life will be wiped off from the book of life and death. He swung the wooden brush in his right hand and drew a line on the iron book of the book of life and death. Immediately, a vast wave of power spread out from the iron book and turned into a gigantic, ferocious ghost head that went to devour Su Ming. Interesting. Your level of cultivation is passable, and your divine abilities are passable. Give me your soul and acknowledge me as your master, and I will spare your life, Su Ming said flatly. At the instant the ghost's head closed in on him, he did not move, but the white ring floating behind him let out a hum and spread out a ripple. As it spread out, the instant it touched the ghost's head, it let out a shrill scream of pain and crumbled. The iron book and wooden brush also crumbled along with it. As for Miao Xing, he coughed up a huge mouthful of blood. Shock appeared on his face, and disbelief appeared on his face. But when he was about to retreat, Su Ming took a light step forward and casually raised his right hand to seize Miao Xing's neck. With his fingers, he clenched his fists, and with an indifferent expression, the old man, do you choose to live or die? Su Ming asked flatly. Miao Xing laughed brokenly. But once he met Su Ming's gaze, his will to self-destruct turned into his heart trembling. He had a strong feeling that even if he self-destructed, he would not be able to harm Su Ming in the slightest. The great difference in their levels of cultivation made it so that he would not be able to cause any trouble in front of Su Ming. He closed his eyes, and his soul fused into the center of his brows. It instantly turned into a brand that floated out as it shone. Su Ming opened his mouth and sucked in a breath. Once he swallowed it, he controlled Miao Xing's life and death. When he unfurled his right hand, the 13 meteors around him roared at the same time. Before the young man in the constellation robe could step on them, the 13 meteors moved simultaneously and charged towards the couple. They surrounded them and formed a gigantic meteor that charged into the whirlwind in the galaxy. They were fleeing on their own, completely ignoring the young man in the constellation robe. Red instantly filled the young man's eyes. At the instant he threw his head back and roared, Su Ming walked over slowly from behind him. The moment Su Ming walked over, the young man in the constellation robe lifted his hands and quickly formed a seal. Madness appeared in his eyes, and he swung his arms outwards. Immediately, the 20-something cultivators who had spread out and fled shuddered. They let out shrill roars, and their bodies instantly withered before they were reduced to ashes. However, the blood in their bodies fused together and turned into a sea of blood that charged toward Su Ming. At the same time, the young man in the constellation robe roared, and his body crumbled with a bang. His blood swept up his nascent divinity, and he charged toward Su Ming. If anyone cast their gaze over, they would find that the area around Su Ming was already filled with a sea of blood. The stench of blood surged into the sky, and a crazed killing intent filled the air. Your cultivation method is pretty good. You've also shown your worth. Acknowledge me as your master, and you can live. Su Ming did not dodge. He cast a cold glance at the young man in the sea of blood. The young man's nascent divinity came to an abrupt halt. After remaining silent for the span of a few breaths, all the sea of blood gathered together and turned into a body of blood. The young man's nascent divinity fused with the body of blood, and he cast Su Ming a complicated glance. He did indeed not intend to fight against Su Ming with his life. Based on his judgment, even if he fought with everything he had, he might not be Su Ming's opponent. He had not hesitated to self-destruct and kill the 20-something people around him because he wanted to display his strongest divine ability. The reason he displayed it was not to fight against Su Ming, but to survive. In silence, he gritted his teeth and struck the center of his brows with his right hand. Immediately, his soul turned into a brand that showed up at the center of his brows. It shone a few times before charging towards Su Ming. Su Ming caught it, and with a squeeze, it fused into his palm. Master, our levels of cultivation are not bad, but Chun Wan and Sima Yu's wife are even more important. They are skilled in runes, and they were the ones in charge of all the runes in the Immortals Union in the past. The 13 meteors were also created by them, but we were the ones who prepared the materials, the young man in the constellation robe said in a dark voice while wrapping his fist in his palm. A glint appeared in Miao Feng's eyes. He stared at the couple who had already fled into the whirlwind in the distance and said in a low voice, "That's right. In fact, there are some weak gaps in the whirlwind, and they were discovered by the couple. If we let them escape, there will be endless troubles in the future." Su Ming did not speak. He lifted his right hand and pointed at the white ring behind him. The ring immediately let out a buzzing sound. It moved, but did not move forward. Instead, it swiftly swelled up, and in an instant it grew to 10,000 feet, 100,000 feet, and even more. With a bang, the ring's edges could no longer be seen. With the place as its center, it continuously swept through the galaxy. Wherever it went, even the whirlwind would be crushed. This scene completely shocked Miao Feng and the young man in the constellation robe. Their pupils shrank, and great shock and fear appeared on their faces. In just the span of a few breaths, the galaxy rumbled, and a white line charged over from the distance. When it closed in on them in an instant, the old man named Miao and the young man in the constellation robe saw with their own eyes that the white line was the shrinking white ring. There was a huge meteor in the white ring. It was the meteor the couple had been running around when they fled. At that moment, no matter how the meteor struggled, it could not rush out of the ring. It could only allow the ring to shrink and continuously drag the meteor back. In the span of a few breaths, Su Ming only stood there when the meteor appeared in front of him. He did not continue fighting back, neither did he struggle fearlessly. The meteor spread out, and the couple appeared in it. Their faces were pale, and when they looked at Su Ming, their gazes were filled with terror. Su Ming cast them a glance and said faintly, "1 to 1 to..." The words were meaningless, but the numbers caused the couple's expressions to change drastically. They cast each other a glance, then gritted their teeth and immediately lifted their hands to strike the center of their brows. In an instant, a brand was formed on their souls, and they flew out of their foreheads to charge towards Su Ming. Clearly, they could tell that Miao Feng and the young man in the constellation robe had already delivered their souls, which was why they were spared from death. Su Ming lifted his right hand and swung it, putting away the brand of the couple's souls. His expression remained calm, and he lifted his head to cast a glance at the space above him. "Fellow Taoist, how long are you going to continue watching? Do you really want me to ask you to come down?" Once he said those words, the hearts of the 4 people in the area trembled. They lifted their heads together and looked over. They had not noticed anything abnormal in the galaxy above them. However, as Su Ming's words echoed in the air, a dry cough came from the air. Soon after, the space the 4 people saw distorted, and a white-haired old man appeared with an awkward expression on his face. There was caution in his eyes, and he hid away the shock and terror he had felt when Su Ming had woken up. "Old Monster One." Miao Feng was the first to recognize this person, and as he spoke, he practically hissed through gritted teeth. "Master, this is the person who sold us the information that there are cultivators in this place who are being treated, which is why we offended you," the man from the couple immediately said while glaring at the white-haired old man. "It's a misunderstanding. This is a misunderstanding." Fellow Taoist, listen to my explanation. In truth, this is the expression of the white-haired old man known as Old Monster when immediately changed. When he spoke, a glint suddenly appeared in his eyes, and before Su Ming could attack, he took the initiative to attack. He swung his arm, and a vast, mighty pressure immediately flew out from it. At the same time, a ray of dark light shone, but it did not attack Su Ming. Instead, it swept up the old man and charged into the air to flee. Clearly, he had been shocked by Su Ming's strength and was forced to change his plan. He did not dare to talk to him, only wanting to leave as soon as possible. Today's target is 4 chapters. I will work hard to complete it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1262. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He cast a scrutinizing glance at the dark light old monster one had flung out of his sleeve. It surrounded him, causing a presence that others might not be able to notice, but Su Ming could sense it clearly. The presence of an ancient god. Interesting. Su Ming swung his arm and pointed at space with his right hand. With it, the galaxy shuddered. The space where old monster one was instantly looked as if it had collapsed, as if it had been frozen. At the same time, black light shone in the frozen galaxy. When Su Ming executed the light of extreme darkness, its power was much stronger than when he had used it with the bald crane. With a whoosh, old monster one let out a shrill scream of pain. He retreated swiftly, but he felt as if he had sunk into mud. In panic, he lifted his right hand and swung it outwards. With a roar, a huge object flew out of his storage bag. It was a finger that was hundreds of feet big and filled with an ancient air appeared. At the instant it appeared, it seemed to be controlled by the old man, and it pointed at space in the light of extreme darkness. Booming sounds echoed in space, and the frozen space shattered. Even some of the light of extreme darkness dissipated, revealing a gap. The old man moved in a flash, intending to escape. The ancient god's finger. Su Ming's pupils shrank. This time, he did not hesitate. With a single move, he instantly appeared in front of the old man and lifted his right hand to strike him. Old monster one roared and formed a seal with his hands before coughing up a mouthful of blood. It fused with the ancient god's finger, causing it to hum. Its aura grew exponentially, and like a huge rod, it charged towards Su Ming with loud bangs. At the same time, a wave of pure ancient god power erupted from the finger and charged towards Su Ming. Even if the ancient god was dead, the power left in the finger was enough to shock an almighty in mastery realm so much that he would not dare to receive it head-on. However, Su Ming's expression was calm. At the instant the ancient god's finger closed in on him, he flipped his right hand over and used the back of his hand to touch it. He naturally took a few steps back, then flipped his right hand over again, as if he had borrowed the old man's power and fused it into his palm. With his cultivation base, he borrowed the old man's power and struck forward. Deafening booming sounds reverberated in the air. The old man coughed up blood and staggered thousands of feet backwards. His face was pale, and when he looked at Su Ming, he suddenly shuddered. He saw Su Ming not chasing after him. But once he struck the ancient god's finger, the huge finger disappeared without a trace, as if he had forcefully put it away. At that moment, he was looking at the old man with the ghost of a smile on his face, and there was a cold, as well as malice. "Senior, please calm down. Please listen to what I have to say. I know the location of a giant's carcass from the Immortals Union. It's a pity that my level of cultivation isn't high enough, so I can only take a finger. That's why I've been searching for people with incredibly powerful divine thoughts in hopes of obtaining the giant's carcass. When I passed by this place several months ago, I noticed the ripples of your cultivation base on the planet, which was why I wanted to test your level of cultivation. My original intention was to work together with you. As for you, you might be careful when you train, but my divine sense is different from that of a normal person. I don't check the ripples of my cultivation base, but can sense the flames of life in this galaxy, which is why I was able to notice your existence. The old man quickly told Su Ming everything. He did not dare to hide anything from Su Ming. Su Ming's strength made him incredibly regret provoking him. If he still hid anything, he would definitely die without a grave. Senior, if you need me, I can lead the way to the giant's corpse and use this to atone for my crimes. I hope that you will give me this chance so that I can make up for the fear I caused you. The old man's face was pale, and his heart was filled with anxiety as he bowed deeply towards Su Ming. Su Ming cast the old man a glance, but did not speak. Instead, he turned around and stared at the pit in which he had isolated himself. With a complicated look in his eyes, he stared at the spot where Bai Feng had been standing outside the pit. That spot was empty. Clearly, Bai Feng had died a long time ago, and her corpse had already turned into dust. A dream in Dark Mountain, a promise made in the snow, and a sigh that had circulated for 1,000 years had come to an end at that moment. Su Ming sighed softly, and the complicated look on his face disappeared. He had gone through 9 cycles of life and death, and he could be considered to have fulfilled the promise made in the past. Their relationship could also be considered to have come to a perfect end. Since that was the case, Su Ming would not force himself to cling to anything. The grudge between him and Bai Feng had also come to an end. He lifted his right hand, and the white ring immediately approached him with a hum. As it shrank, it wrapped itself around Su Ming's finger and turned into a real ring. A feeling that he could not be separated from the ring grew in Su Ming's heart. There was fate between him and the ring. It was a knot in the cycle of life and death, and no one could undo it. The thing that made the knot become eternal was the ring's spirit. Perhaps it was different from before because Bai Ling's soul was contained within it. He swung his arm, and a black robe appeared on Su Ming's body. It enveloped him, causing others to be unable to see his face. They could only see a black-robed person. Almost at the instant Su Ming put on the black robe, Miao Feng's pupils shrank. He sucked in a sharp breath, and shock appeared in his eyes again. As a member of the Immortals Union, there was no way he would not recognize a black-robed person like Su Ming. I, Miao Feng of the Will Tower race of the Immortals Union, greet my lord and grand immortal. There was a slightly complicated look on the young man's face, but he soon lowered his head and bowed respectfully to Su Ming. I, Dao Zhong of the branch family of Morning Dao sect, greet my lord and grand immortal. I, Sima Yu of the Rune Puppet sect of the Immortals Union, greet my lord and grand immortal Zhang Dao. When Chun Wan and his wife saw Su Ming, a dazed look appeared on their faces. They cast each other a glance, then lowered their heads in anguish and bowed sincerely to him. They had met Zhang Ji Dao before, which was why the way they greeted him was different from the others. They could tell clearly that the black-robed people who had appeared in the Immortals Union were all subordinates of the person before them. They might have only seen the black-robed person in the past and could not see his face, which was why it was difficult for them to recognize him. However, the mighty pressure coming from Su Ming's body was the exact same as the black-robed Zhang Dao, who even the higher-ups of the Immortals Union had to be polite to. In midair, Old Monster Wind's face turned even paler. As he stared at the black-robed Su Ming, he groaned in his heart. He had not expected that Su Ming would be an immortal from the First World, and he had even said that he wanted the giant's corpse, which was also an immortal from the First World. How did you walk in the whirlwind? The black-robed Su Ming asked hoarsely. At that moment, an ancient presence exuded from his body. There was a mysteriousness about him, causing all those who saw him to feel their hearts tremble. Junior's divine sense is different from others. Old Eccentric once said, his expression one of extreme respect. That's why I can see the trajectory of the destructive power in the hurricane. That's why I can walk through the hurricane and avoid the destructive power. Although it's slow, it's still better than being trapped in one place. Come in. Lead the way. Su Ming swung his arm, and a faint white ripple spread out from his ring to surround an area of 300 feet around him. Old Monster Wind hesitated in his heart, but he did not dare to think too much about it. He braced himself and stepped into the area of 300 feet around Su Ming. Then he bowed to Meow Feng and the other three, who had hostile expressions on their faces. Only then did he point the way in a low voice. A glint shone in Su Ming's eyes, which were hidden under the black robe. Immediately, the white ripple charged forward. When it passed by the 13 meteors, Su Ming put them away. With a loud whoosh, the white ripple charged towards the whirlwind. Wherever it went, the whirlwind would tumble backwards. Even the destructive power of the world within it would scatter when it touched the ripple. How many survivors like you are there in true Morning Dao world? Su Ming asked hoarsely while sitting in the white ripple. Meow Feng and the other three were silent for a moment before Chen Wen, who was skilled in runes, said in a low voice, "We can only stay in a room. We can't go too far away. Fellow Taoist one, you should know the details." Meow Feng and the other three were silent for a moment before Chen Wen, who was skilled in runes, said softly, "Only 1 in 1,000 can survive. I've gone to many places over the past 10 months, but I've only seen 2 rather large gathering spots. The others are scattered in groups of 3 to 5. Many of them died in the disaster and the chaos that followed after it." Old Monster once said softly, "The Immortals Union has already been reduced to ruins. All the entrances to Morning Dao sect have collapsed. I don't know what's going on inside, but I can sense a great wave of death from the divine sense that has entered the place. Perhaps a drastic change has also happened in Morning Dao sect." Old Monster when cast Su Ming a glance and told him everything he knew. Morning Dao sect. Su Ming's eyes closed slightly under the black robe. From a moment one of the life extermination fragments had been taken from his soul, he could guess that Su Xian he had carried out a bloodbath in Morning Dao sect. It was not out of Su Ming's expectations that everything in that place had been reduced to ruins. He was only worried about Su Hui. Had she died in the disaster, or had she managed to escape? He sighed in his heart, and it turned into a stab of pain that made him fall silent. Old Monster when hesitated for a moment before he suddenly said, "But those who survived are definitely not weak. With your level of cultivation, you can gather these people together and form a new sect." Su Ming lifted his head and cast Old Monster when a cold glance. When his heart trembled, Su Ming nodded slowly. He knew some things that the people in this place did not know. He knew that the whirlwind surrounding true Morning Dao world was not eternal. It would disappear after a period of time. Perhaps it would be a short period of time, or perhaps it would be a long period of time, but at the very most, it would not be long. Once the whirlwind disappeared, Dark Dawn and Saint Defire would descend through the gap. At that time, what awaited arid triad expanse cosmos would be a bloody storm. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1263. However, this had nothing to do with Su Ming, and he did not want to bother with it. Instead, Old Monster when suggestion had given him a thought. There are no longer any sects or clans in true Morning Dao world. If I gather all the remaining people together and form a sect, then it will be a force of power that belongs solely to me once Saint Defire descends. Since I've chosen to keep Zhang Ji Dao's identity, then this force of power will be of great help to me. At the very least, true Morning Dao world will belong to me alone. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. The white ripple charged through the whirlwind in true Morning Dao world. Su Ming sat down and meditated, remaining silent. He did not speak, and the others beside him also fell silent. Only the bald crane continued flaunting its prowess with a smug look on its face. It would occasionally cast provocative glances at the group of people. In its eyes, these people were just asking for death. Even if Su Ming had not woken up with its divine abilities, it could still chase away all of them. At that moment, it had clearly forgotten about the pathetic state it had been in previously days past, and in the blink of an eye, 7 days went by. 7 days was not long, but the speed of the white ripple was equivalent to warping. Wherever it went, the whirlwind would retreat. It was so fast that in just 7 days, Su Ming and the others arrived at the spot where Old Monster one had mentioned the ancient god's corpse. It was a region where the whirlwind was incredibly strong. There was an endless amount of wind in the region that swept in all directions. Su Ming could see a corpse that was nearly hundreds of thousands of feet big in the wind. There were many parts of the corpse that were damaged and filled with the aura of death. It floated in the whirlwind, and its flesh and blood were torn. There were quite a number of places where the bones had shattered, and it looked as if it would be swept away at any moment. The ancient god did not have his right arm. He only had 3 fingers left on his left hand. His face was already indistinct, but Su Ming could still see the mark of a star at the center of the ancient god's brows. "This is the place," said old eccentric one hastily. "8 months ago, I passed by this place and found the giant's corpse. At the time it was intact, but now it's damaged to this extent. However, for it to be able to survive the hurricane without shattering shows how powerful its body must have been when it was alive. If you could use its body to refine a magical treasure, it would definitely be a precious treasure." As he stared at the ancient god's corpse, Su Ming's eyes sparkled. With one move, he immediately went to the region where the white ripple was. With a whirlwind in his face, he instantly stood on the ancient god's body. With a step forward, he charged to the center of the ancient god's brows. After a moment, when he closed in, he stood at the center of the ancient god's brows and lowered his head to look at the only mark of the star. It was dim, but based on Su Ming's understanding of the ancient god, it seemed that all the power of his cultivation base was gathered on the stars at the center of his brows. After a moment of pensive silence, Su Ming sat down cross-legged, lifted his right hand, and pushed it against the mark of the star. When he closed his eyes, his face changed under the black robe, and in an instant he turned into the clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole. However, this appearance was not corporeal, but an illusion. After all of Su Ming's clones had been destroyed in space in the past. As long as a soul was around, he could gather them together again, but he needed to digest different powers. For example, Dao Kong's clone required the least amount of energy, and it was also the simplest. What it needed was Su Ming's cultivation base, but with Zhang Jidao's body, it was no longer useful to Su Ming, which was why he had not tried to restore his clone. As for his clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole, he needed a powerful physical body, which was why Su Ming had rushed over once he heard about the ancient god's corpse. As for his Akang clone, he needed to use up Akang's power, but Su Ming was prepared for this. He was the complete Akang, and he only needed some time to recover. However, that time was rather short, and if Su Ming could find the fragments of his soul that had escaped from Akang's world in the past and devour them, then his Akang clone would be formed in the shortest amount of time possible. "I no longer have a fleshly body, or perhaps my fleshly body doesn't even exist. It perished countless years ago. In that case, what I need to do is not to obtain a fleshly body, but to create a body that truly belongs to me. This body will have all my clones as my flesh and blood, my cultivation base as my bones, and the epiphany I gained from moving from winter to spring to form my soul. Once my flesh, blood, bones, and soul fuse perfectly with each other, I will be able to form my real self." A brilliant light shone in Su Ming's eyes, which were hidden under the black robe. With a glint in his eyes, he swiftly closed them, and with his right hand pressed against the mark of the ancient god's brows, he seized it. However, at the instant he was about to seize the mark of the star, Su Ming's palm suddenly froze. As his eyes sparkled, he cast a scrutinizing glance at the ancient god, then lifted his head to cast a glance at old monster one in the distance. A hint of a cold sneer appeared at the corners of his lips. However, he did not continue sneering. Instead, he swiftly seized the mark of the star with his right hand. With it, a vast amount of power surged into Su Ming's body through his right hand with a bang. In an instant, it filled his entire physical body. Explode! Explode! Light shone in old monster Wen's eyes as he stood in the white ripple in the distance. He was shouting loudly in his heart while feeling smug. Su Ming was not the first person he had found. In truth, He was the third person he had lured into this place over the past few months. All of them coveted the ancient god's physical power and wanted to absorb it, but the previous two had self-destructed and died while absorbing it. Su Ming was the third. In old Monster Wind's eyes, he could already foresee that in a few breaths, Su Ming's entire body would explode. Once he died, all of his treasures would belong to him. There was a smug look in his eyes, but as time passed, and when 10 breaths passed, old Monster Wind gradually became hesitant. He stared at Su Ming at the center of the giant's brows. His aura had gone berserk, and as his robes fluttered, he looked as if he was continuously absorbing the power. But the scene of him exploding did not appear. This scene caused old Monster Wind's heart to let out a thump. It's fine, it's fine. It's only been 10 breaths. Before long, this person will definitely explode. No one can absorb this giant's physical power. Even if he's a grand immortal, it's impossible for him to do so. After all, this is what the ancient god told me personally. He said that no one can obtain his physical power. Old Monster Wind sucked in a deep breath, but time trickled by. 20 breaths later, his face gradually turned pale. At the same time, a cold sneer appeared on Su Ming's lips. He had long since noticed that what his right hand absorbed from the mark of the star was not his physical power, but a hidden divine thought of the ancient god. That divine thought had disguised itself as physical power, and like a bird disguised as a candle, it devoured all the moths that pounced on it. With this devouring, he could continuously repair his body until his injuries were completely healed. The ancient gods who descended in arid triad expanse cosmos are at most 7 stars. Forget the fact that you're not injured. Even if you're a 7-star ancient god in perfect condition, I can still fight against him, much less your current condition, where you're heavily injured and recuperating. You want to disguise your divine thought as physical power so that I can devour it and obtain my cultivation base and nascent divinity to become nutrients for your recovery? You overestimate yourself a little too much. When Su Ming absorbed the divine thought, he sent his own divine thought outwards. It rushed into the ancient god's mind through his right hand and turned into a thunderous roar. The ancient god shuddered at that instant. His eyes flew open, and a hint of terror appeared in them. The cold sneer on Su Ming's lips grew wider. The ring on his right index finger shuddered, and white ripples spread out from it. They rushed into the ancient god's mind through the mark of the star, and as booming sounds surged into the sky, they turned into a suppressive power. At the same time, Su Ming lifted his right hand, and with one move, he appeared on the ancient god's left arm. He lifted his left hand and seized it. I'll use your body to test an incredibly diabolical forbidden art from Saint Defire Expanse Cosmos in Zhang Jidao's memories. Turbid flesh of hell. At the instant Su Ming's left hand touched the ancient god's left arm, a black ripple spread out from it, and the ancient god's left arm started withering at a speed visible to the naked eye. As it did so, the ancient god trembled violently, but his divine thought was suppressed, and he could not fight back. He could only feel his entire left arm turn into a bag of bones in the span of a few breaths. At the same time, a large amount of physical power surged into Su Ming's body, causing his clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole to gain corporeal form at an incredibly terrifying speed. In just the span of 10 breaths, the ancient god's left arm no longer had any flesh or blood, but that was not the end. Once the ancient god's left arm was reduced to a bag of bones, the ancient god's body, legs, and torso started withering away. A vast amount of physical power was continuously absorbed by Su Ming, causing his clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole to instantly gather together and become stronger. The process of the turbid flesh of hell lasted for the time it takes for half an incense stick to burn. The gigantic ancient god was still huge, but he had become completely emaciated. He looked like a skeleton, and it was an incredibly terrifying sight. This scene also caused the faces of Miao, Feng, and the other 3 to turn pale. Fear appeared in their eyes, and when they looked at Su Ming, it was as if they were looking at an evil spirit. Hell skeleton. Su Ming moved, and this time, he appeared above the ancient god's head. He pushed his left hand against the ancient god's skull and seized it. Cracking sounds reverberated in the air, and black ripples spread out from Su Ming's hand to cover the ancient god's entire body. The ancient god trembled even more violently. If it weren't for the white ring suppressing him, then his miserable howls would be echoing out in all directions, instead of just trembling. That feeling caused the ancient god's eyes to turn bloodshot. He wished he could self-detonate, but because he was being suppressed by the white ring, he couldn't do that. As he trembled, his legs gradually melted, and his body gradually became soft. All his bones melted at that moment and turned into bone powder. They were swiftly absorbed by Su Ming's left hand and fused into his clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1264. I wonder just how strong my clone that practices the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole will become if I devour a complete ancient god. Su Ming's eyes sparkled. After the time it takes for half an incense stick to burn, Miao Feng and the others felt their skins crawl. They saw that the gigantic ancient god only had a head left. His flesh and blood had withered away, his bones had melted, and his body was no longer a body. Reincarnation. Dark light shone in Su Ming's eyes. He lifted his left hand and pushed his palm against the top of the ancient god's skull. With a sharp intake of breath, the ancient god opened his mouth and let out a shocking roar. As he roared, his head melted, and after a moment, the huge ancient god in the whirlwind no longer existed. Only Su Ming remained seated and quietly circulated his cultivation base to digest the ancient god's soul, to nourish his clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole. Almost at the instant the ancient god died, Old Monster One let out a shrill scream of pain in the white ripple. His body shuddered, and his body and soul were destroyed. His entire body turned into ashes and disappeared. Time trickled by. When half a month passed, Su Ming opened his eyes. The brilliant light in them was aggressive, like a sharp sword. But when he closed his eyes and opened them again, the brilliant light in his eyes disappeared, replaced by calmness. Death, and reincarnation. These are the three forbidden arts of Saint Defire Expanse Cosmos. Since they're forbidden arts, why was there need to create them? From Zhang Jidao's memories, these three forbidden arts were created specifically to target the ancient gods. They were created to kill ancient gods to strengthen their physical bodies. These three forbidden arts can turn the ancient gods' flesh, bones, and souls into pure physical power. This art was originally not a forbidden art, but many years ago, a Saint Defire appeared among the ancient gods, which was why it was known as a forbidden art. In Saint Defire Expanse Cosmos, all those who cast this art against the ancient gods and other races will have their blood relatives destroyed. However, it's slightly difficult to execute this art. The ancient god must not be able to struggle, and his divine thought cannot control his body, or else it will be difficult for him to succeed. There will even be signs of a backlash. Fortunately, the ring is suppressing the ancient god's will, which is why it went so smoothly. This is also related to his heavy injuries. Otherwise, it would have taken some effort to use this forbidden technique. Su Ming stood up slowly and touched the ring that had long since returned to his finger. With a step forward, he stepped into the white ripple floating in the galaxy. Congratulations, my lord, on successfully fusing with the power of the physical body. Miao Feng and his group had been incredibly nervous during the past half a month. They had witnessed Su Ming devouring the ancient god, and they could not calm down. This overturned everything they knew about the giant. They knew just how strong the giant was, and they could accept it even if Su Ming could absorb it. However, when they witnessed him forcefully devouring it so quickly and in such a ferocious and terrifying manner, great fear rose in their hearts. When they saw Su Ming returning, the four of them bowed respectfully to him without any hesitation. Su Ming cast a glance at the spot where Old Monster One had disappeared, and a hint of derision shone in his eyes. Su Ming's suspicions towards Old Monster One had arisen when he asked him how he had managed to move in the whirlwind. When he saw the ancient god's body, Su Ming's suspicions were verified. Old Monster One's life had clearly been controlled by the ancient god, or perhaps he had obtained some benefits at the same time, which was why he had begun searching for people to come to this place. He used the excuse of obtaining the power of the physical body, but in truth, he was just sending people to the ancient god's side so that he could absorb them to heal himself. Su Ming stood in the white ripple and cast a glance at the galaxy where the ancient god's body had originally been. The whirlwind there was incredibly strong. As it howled, it swept through the area. There seemed to be a vortex in the depths of the whirlwind. It rotated slowly, and occasionally, a hint of the whirlwind would seep into it. When Su Ming saw that place, his gaze focused. "Do any of you know what this place was originally?" he asked calmly. Dao Zhong, who was dressed in a constellation robe, fell into a moment of pensive silence before he wrapped his fist in his palm and said, "Master, this place. If my memory serves me correctly, this was once one of the relocation spots in Morning Dao sect." Su Ming did not speak. His gaze was fixed on the relocation spot in the whirlwind. He lifted his right hand and swung it outwards. Immediately, the white ripple around them spread outwards. In an instant, it covered an area of several tens of thousands of feet. With a bang, it continued spreading outwards, and only when it covered an area of 300,000 something feet did it stop. As the white ripple spread out, the whirlwind tumbled backwards. Even the power of the world in it was pushed back, causing the area of 300,000 feet to become empty. Soon after, Su Ming swung his arm, and the 13 huge meteors he had put away flew out. They surrounded the area and rotated slowly. Su Ming charged towards the relocation rune in the distance. He sat down cross-legged beside the broken relocation rune and lowered his head to observe it carefully. Then, he closed his eyes and sank into a moment of pensive silence. When the disaster descended on true Morning Dao world, the Immortals Union no longer existed, and neither did Morning Dao sect. Right now, I will create a sect in this place, and its name will be Ninth Summit. Each of you will receive a protective ripple from me. Not only will it allow you to move in the whirlwind, it can also be used as a form of defense. Search for all the remaining cultivators in this true world and invite them into the sect. Those who obey will be protected, and those who don't, record down their locations. I will visit them one by one. Also, the four of you will record the portraits in these jade slips. If you see any of these 3 people, immediately send a message to them, and I will immediately rush over. Su Ming lifted his head. When he lifted his right hand, 4 jade slips appeared on his palm. Once he focused his mind and branded them, he flung them towards the 4 people. Once Miao Feng and the other 3 people caught them, they focused their attention on them and immediately memorized the portraits of the 3 men in the jade slips. The 3 men each had their own unique characteristics. The first was a headless person, but his murderous aura surged into the sky, causing all those who saw him to be able to sense killing intent crashing into their faces. The second was a man who smiled like a flower. He was very gentle, and his smile was like the spring breeze, causing all those who saw him to be unable to forget him. As for the third, he was a man who looked like a boorish man. He had a built body and a naive expression on his face, causing all those who saw him to pay attention to him. The 4 people bowed towards Su Ming. He swung his arm, and white ripples immediately appeared under their feet. They moved back and instantly turned into 4 long arcs that charged into 3 different directions. Once they left, the land sank into silence. Su Ming stared at the relocation rune and shook his head in silence. This rune is completely sealed off and is also badly damaged. It'll be too difficult to open it and enter Morning Dao sect. But if Hu Zi was here, perhaps he would have a way. Su Ming lifted his head and stared at the galaxy before he quietly closed his eyes. Creating Ninth Summit and taking control of Morning Dao World were things Su Ming needed to complete before Saint Defire and Dark Dawn arrived. Only by doing so could he gather all the power he could to have a chance of obtaining a serendipity in the true disaster that would destroy a world which would be much more violent compared to the whirlwind at the moment. Only then would he have a chance of obtaining a serendipity. Based on Zhang Jit Dao's memories, Saint Defire Expanse Cosmos only cares about Arid Triad because Arid Triad is an expanse cosmos. It can give birth to arid saints who are as famous as the 3 Saint Defires and the 3 Sovereigns of Dawn. In fact, they might even surpass them. Saint Defire Expanse Cosmos has Saint Defire Expanse Cosmos. Dark Dawn Expanse Cosmos has Sovereigns of Dawn, and Arid Triad Expanse Cosmos has Arid Gods. One Expanse Cosmos has 3 deity positions. Only when one becomes an Arid God, especially the first Arid God, can he look down on all 3 Expanse Cosmoses. I can't write anymore. I'm going to break the 4th chapter. I beg for monthly votes. I beg for recommendation votes. To be continued. If you like this work, I welcome you to come to Start Point to cast recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1265. Time trickled by. Whirlwinds howled all year round in the galaxy beyond the white ripple. They were like the roars of malicious spirits that continued echoing in space. If anyone listened to them for a prolonged period of time, they would feel as if they were in the netherworld. Su Ming had already grown fond of being alone. He was used to meditating alone quietly. As he did so, he regulated his cultivation base and tried to understand his seasons of winter, autumn, summer, and spring. However, since his physical body had yet to be formed, he was still a little short of completing the will of spring, and he could not complete his journey. When Su Ming formed his true physical body that belonged solely to him, he would completely step into the will of spring, and with the revival of spring, his true physical body would be perfected. Then, he would open his eyes and see a different world. It would be just like his dream when he was in the land of berserkers. He would open his eyes and see the world that others could not see. Su Ming had once thought that this day was very close, but when he looked at it now, he knew that while the distance was close, he did not know how close it was. He would have to walk through it step by step. The 9 cycles of life and death ended the fate between him and Bai Ling. He might be slightly melancholic, but what was in the past was in the past. It was not Su Ming's personality to force things. From a moment Bai Feng chose to stand against him, this ending was set in stone. No matter how it ended, it could be considered to be a perfect ending. The 9 cycles of life and death ended Su Ming's story with Bai Ling. He formed the ties of fate with a white ring again and again. At the same time, he sensed the existence of the power of fate in the realm of masters of fate, lives, and death in the cycles of life and death in mortal refinement. This was an epiphany, and it was because of Bai Ling and the ring. This epiphany was related to him, but it was mostly related to the people around him. If he looked at it in terms of the laws of fate, then this fate was the fate of the world outside, but it was also faintly related to him. Fate realm is too wondrous for words. This saying is true. This realm might be somewhat similar to Avacania realm, or perhaps there are some similarities between them. Right now, I can sense the existence of the fate in the world beyond. This existence is in my heart, and it is manifested in my hands. Su Ming mumbled and lowered his head to look at his hands. In silence, he lifted his right hand and seized the air. Immediately, wisps of black light appeared and gathered on his hands. The black light was the light of extreme darkness. It appeared like grass ropes, and they were slowly woven into knots in Su Ming's hand. The knots gathered together, and in the end, a doll made of the light of extreme darkness appeared in Su Ming's hand. As he stared at the doll in his hand, Su Ming could not recognize who it was. It looked like him, but there was an even greater sense of unfamiliarity. It was as if it contained all the lives in the world, as well as the faces of all the people Su Ming had met in his life. With a fling of his arm, the knot on the doll was untied. Once it turned into two lights of extreme darkness again, Su Ming wove them in his hands again. This time, he wanted to weave himself, but as time passed, Su Ming noticed that he could not successfully weave himself. It was as if he was always lacking something and could not reach perfection. Then, Su Ming sighed softly and gave up on continuing to weave the doll. The fate in the world beyond will turn into the doll in my hands. This is the fate in the world beyond. If I can weave my own doll one day, then I will be considered to have mastered my own fate, and I will have perfected Fate Realm. Similarly, I weaved it with the light of extreme darkness. If I can use the threads of laws in the galaxy to weave a doll, then the power of the laws of fate will reach an absolute level. Su Ming released his grip, and the doll disappeared. The former is an epiphany, and the latter is a divine ability. When they're fused together, only then will I have the complete power of Fate Realm. But this Fate Realm is the Fate Realm of arid triad expanse cosmos. Compared to the powerful warriors in Saint Defire's camp, it is still far inferior. But if I can use laws to weave a doll, then take a step further and use my light of extreme darkness to replace the threads of laws in the galaxy, then it will be the same as me creating and changing the laws. By doing so, I will definitely be able to surpass the average person in Fate Realm and fight against the powerful warriors in Saint Defire's camp. Su Ming pondered over this for a moment, and a glint appeared in his eyes. Mountain Shifter and Ocean Remover is the strongest divine ability I have besides the inborn ability of the Abyss Builders. Then next, perhaps I will have another. Seize the heavens and switch the sun. Seize the heavens is the completion of the laws of fate. I will be the heavens, and I will be fate. As for the switch the sun, it means that I will have my own fate replace the original laws. It won't be a temporary change, but a permanent one. And the strongest in this realm is what I can imagine right now. I will replace all the laws in true Morning Tao world and gather them together with my will. By doing so, I will replace true Morning Tao world's will, and I will become true Morning Tao world. Su Ming's eyes shone brilliantly. When that day comes, even if the people from Saint Defire's camp descend, they will be wary of me. Even if their level of cultivation is higher than mine, as long as it's not too much higher than mine, they will only be on par with me. After all, I have already turned true Morning Tao world into myself. I am true Morning Tao world, and true Morning Tao world is me. And with the identity of Zhangji Dao acting as a medium for me, then true Morning Tao world can be said to belong completely to me. This must be it. Before the whirlwind disappears, I must do this. Only then will I have the right to participate in the upcoming disaster and obtain a serendipity. The light in Su Ming's eyes grew brighter. He had found his current direction. The first step is to solidify the fate in the world around me. The second step is to figure out my own fate and gather it together until I reach perfection in my epiphany. The third step is to use the light of extreme darkness to replace the laws in a small area. The fourth step, which is also the final step, is to replace true Morning Tao world's will and turn true Morning Tao world into the world of extreme darkness. The first step is simple, and I can do it now. I just need to spend some time. But the second step, how can I use the fastest speed to control my own fate? Su Ming frowned slightly and sank into deep thought. Time passed. Several days later, a glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. At the same time, a brilliant light shone in his eyes. He lifted his right hand and drew a circle in the air before him. The circle slowly grew larger. When it was hundreds of feet wide, understanding appeared on Su Ming's face. The fate in the world around me can form this circle, and my own fate can continuously make the circle grow larger. When it reaches a certain size, it will have gathered too many fates from the world around me, and it will naturally grow until I have perfect control over my own fate. This control is a slow control from small to large. As the circle grows larger, then everything within its area will be in my control. Slowly, I will have a feeling as if I am in control of my own laws of fate. This feeling will become stronger, and when it turns into a will, I will have perfected it. But I can't take this path, because I will need to spend too much time. It would be fine if this was any other time, but now that the disaster is upon us, what I lack the most is time. Then perhaps I have another method to step into the state where I can control my own laws of fate. No one should have taken this method before, but I can still succeed. Confidence appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He did not think of this method out of thin air. Instead, he had come to understand it through his epiphany towards the cycles of reincarnation during mortal refinement. The cycles of reincarnation during mortal refinement are in truth countless points in a cycle of reincarnation. I could say that I have experienced 9 different lives during the same period of time. They intersect with each other and are connected to each other like a huge net. These are all external fates, but if I can experience more and have more lives, then this net will become larger, and each intersecting point will be my will. Then, when it reaches a certain point, I will be able to control my own laws of fate through the fate in the world around me. With my will as the center, countless lives will be born, and through these lives, the fate will spread out again until the net is formed. Then, through other lives, I will be able to control my own laws of fate. This is a theory, and it should not be wrong, but if I want to use it, I'll have to make some changes. After all, I can't truly reincarnate countless lives, but I can gain an epiphany through the lives of others. The prerequisite is that they have me in their hearts, and they have to worship and respect me. Then, the wills they produce can be connected to each other and turn into the net of reincarnation I need. Su Ming fell into pensive silence. This logic might sound complicated, but if you try to understand it in simple terms, he could say that controlling one's own laws of fate was a form of confidence, and controlling the laws of fate in the world around him could be compared to how many people knew him. It was nothing if 10 people knew him, and even if there were hundreds or thousands of people who knew him, it would still be nothing. However, if there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people who knew him, then it would mean that he had control over the fate in the world around him. This sort of fate would increase, and when it reached an incredibly terrifying number, he would be filled with confidence. This sort of confidence would be the power of the laws of fate that would allow him to control his own fate. This sort of fame was in truth the same principle. Those who became famous were bound to be famous. This was the power of fate. It's just like the people I saved in the world of Nine. They formed their own race and worshipped me. They remembered my appearance in their hearts, and the power of their wills they sent to me naturally became my laws of fate. If that's the case, then if I can make more people worship me and respect me, then their wills can turn into the net of reincarnation, and I can become stronger day by day in the net. Then, I can obtain my own fate through them. In fact, through them, it will be even easier for me to seize true morning Tao world and replace the laws with my will. Resolve appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He mulled over it carefully for a moment, and once he was certain that this idea was feasible, he closed his eyes and immersed himself in meditation. He became even more certain of his plan to unify true morning Tao world. I've sent the first chapter to you. I'll continue writing my story and ask for monthly votes on the last day. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1266. In the blink of an eye, 3 months went by. During those 3 months, Su Ming continued sitting and meditating to solidify his epiphany towards the laws of fate so that he could fuse them together in his body and mind. On this day, Su Ming opened his eyes slowly and stared at the galaxy in the distance. There was a profound look in his eyes, as if the universe was contained within them. Before long, a long arc charged out from the whirlwind in the galaxy. There were white ripples around the long arc, and wherever it went, the whirlwind would scatter, allowing the person to increase his speed to a certain degree. In the span of a few breaths, he closed in on the spot where Su Ming was. Once he rushed over, he turned into Miao Cheng when he was hundreds of feet away from him. He wrapped his fist in his palm and bowed deeply towards Su Ming. "Greetings, my lord." Su Ming's expression remained the same. He cast Miao Cheng a faint glance and nodded slightly. "My lord, I investigated the area to the east and discovered tens of thousands of cultivators remaining. They were either in groups of 3 to 5 or in groups of hundreds. They were scattered in various hidden spots in the east. Most of them were wary of my arrival, and beside the small number of people who happily agreed to the sex choice, most of them were hesitant," Miao Cheng said with his head lowered. Su Ming swept his gaze past Miao Cheng's body and asked calmly, "What's with your injuries?" "It's about 2 months to the east, and it's also the furthest place I've been to. There's a small army that once belonged to Morning Dao sect there. There are about 10,000-something people there, but they refused to join the sect. They also coveted the treasure that can move through the whirlwind, my lord." When Miao Cheng said those words, he lifted his head and cast Su Ming a glance, but he did not continue speaking. A barely noticeable glint shone in Su Ming's eyes. He cast a scrutinizing glance at Miao Cheng, then lifted his right hand and swung it. Immediately, a medicinal core appeared out of nowhere on his palm and charged towards Miao Cheng. This core came from the first plane. It can help you recover from your injuries. Once you swallow it, meditate for 2 hours, then bring me to the place where I injured you. Once Su Ming finished speaking, he closed his eyes, but his divine sense was locked on to the old man in the distance, and he started observing him carefully. The old man took the medicinal pill and swallowed it without any hesitation. He immediately sat down and began to meditate. Soon, his body was covered in sweat. 2 hours later, the old man's eyes snapped open, and they were filled with excitement. Popping sounds echoed from his body. In reality, only a portion of his injuries had appeared this time. He had also been injured during the calamity back then, and he had been suppressing it. However, after 2 hours of meditation, he had almost recovered from all his injuries, causing his cultivation base to become slightly stronger. It was clear just how valuable this medicinal pill was. This caused gratitude to appear in Miao Feng's gaze when he looked at Su Ming. As it did so, Su Ming, who had his eyes closed, noticed with his divine sense that a faint power of the laws of fate had appeared around the old man, but it was leaning towards him. The old man himself could not sense that power, but Su Ming could. This proved that his previous analysis was effective. At that moment, without any hesitation, Su Ming opened his eyes and did not move. However, overlapping shadows instantly appeared around him. An indistinct figure took a step forward and turned into another Su Ming. He was also dressed in a black robe, but this was Su Ming's clone. It was the clone that he had just recovered and was even stronger than before. A faint layer of golden light shone on the clone. It was one of Su Ming's personalities, and at that moment, it was separated from his clone. In the past, Su Ming had not been able to control his own personality, but now, as he gained an epiphany and gained control over the fate of the world around him, he could control his different personalities perfectly. He could even separate them and fuse them into different clones. "Lead the way." A hoarse voice came from Su Ming's clone under the black robe. Miao Cheng immediately voiced his obedience. He stood up and turned into a long arc that charged into the distance with Su Ming's clone. White ripples appeared under their feet. When they spread outwards, they pushed away the whirlwind, causing them to become faster. It was especially so for Su Ming's clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole. He was so strong that even if he was in the whirlwind, he could still force his way through it for a period of time without suffering too much damage. After all, his flesh, blood, and bones were formed by absorbing the ancient god's body. The physical power he possessed might not be able to be said to be indestructible, but it was already difficult to destroy. Booming sounds shook the heavens. The 2 long arcs charged into the distance. After a moment, they disappeared into the whirlwind. Su Ming, who was sitting in the empty space formed by the hundreds of thousands of white ripples, slowly lowered his head, closed his eyes again, and began meditating. Time passed. Su Ming's clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole moved through the galaxy with his powerful physical power. He was so fast that he surpassed Miao Cheng's speed. In the end, Su Ming's clone grabbed Miao Cheng's arm, stirred up a piercing sound of air being torn, and charged forward at a speed that was even faster than lightning. Miao Cheng's heart was filled with excitement, but he was also shocked. He already knew that his master had astonishing power, but he did not expect that even a clone would possess such terrifying power. This shocked him, and at the same time, he no longer had any intention of rebelling against Su Ming. Instead, he submitted to him. Half a month after the clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole left, a long arc charged past the region where Su Ming's body was meditating. This time, it was very weak, and it seemed to be struggling to rush back. Once it rushed into the region where the ripples were, it turned into Dao Zhong, a young man dressed in a constellation robe. His face was pale, and he coughed up a large mouthful of blood. There were a large number of white insects squirming in his blood. Once they were spat out, they let out shrill screams and shattered with banging sounds. They turned into centipedes with wings, and as they screamed, they charged towards Dao Zhong. Master! Dao Zhong, who seemed to be in an incredibly weakened state, immediately let out a low growl. He lifted his right hand, but just as he was about to have a hint of his cultivation base erupt from his body, Su Ming opened his eyes while meditating in the distance. He lifted his right hand and pointed forward. With it, a power of time descended on the area where the young man was. It turned into a terrifying reversal in that small area, and as it did so, the centipedes with wings fell back and turned back into the white insects in the blood. In fact, the blood also flowed in reverse and returned to Dao Zhong's mouth. At the same time, Dao Zhong's body trembled. After the span of 3 to 5 breaths, there was a loud bang, and countless white threads crawled out of his pores. They gathered in midair to form a small white ball the size of a fist. As the small white ball gathered together, Dao Zhong's level of cultivation rapidly changed from its weakened state. When he recovered to the point where he was not at his peak, but he had most of his cultivation base, the power to reverse time disappeared. Dao Zhong was stunned. He shuddered slightly, and when he looked at Su Ming, his gaze was filled with an unprecedented fear. His heart trembled. He could sense that what had happened to him just now was the power of time. It was the reversal of time, a great divine ability that could control time. Only this sort of divine ability could instantly heal his injuries and make the white threads come out of his body the way they had entered his body until he returned to his original form. Su Ming's strength shocked Dao Zhong at that moment, as if he had been suppressed. He sucked in a sharp breath and bowed deeply towards Su Ming. With respect in his eyes, he spoke in a low voice. "Thank you for saving me, Master." "What happened?" Su Ming asked faintly. He seized the air with his right hand, and the small white ball immediately tumbled backwards. Su Ming caught it and started scrutinizing it. "Master, I've investigated 31 places where cultivators still live to the west of this place. Most of them have less than 100 people. Only 2 of them have thousands of people. They are 2 shattered planets. Based on my observations, I can tell that these 2 places were once inhabited by cultivators from the Immortals Union. And there are 4 of them who are in Mastery Realm. During one of my investigations, I was heavily injured by one of my old enemies. If it wasn't because I had the treasure you gave me to escape into the whirlwind, and that person could not chase after me, I might have died there," Dao Zhong said with a wry smile. And Dao Zhong hesitated for a moment. "Speak," Su Ming said faintly while staring at the small white ball in his hand. "And the force of power from the Immortals Union who chased after me seems to have built a sect," Dao Zhong immediately said. Su Ming averted his gaze from the small white ball and closed his eyes slightly. Immediately, overlapping shadows appeared on his body again. In the span of a breath, a layer of fog manifested from his body. Once he took a step forward, it turned into the indistinct figure of a man. There was an indescribable malevolence about the man. This was Su Ming's Ikang clone, and the gray part of Su Ming's personality was also present in it. It represented destruction and slaughter, and it was the will of midwinter. The gray fused into the Ikang clone, causing long gray hair to gradually appear. The gray-haired man's face could not be seen clearly, but once he appeared, a powerful killing intent spread out from his body. From now on, there can only be one sect in true Morning Dao world. A second sect is not allowed to appear. Once it does, we will destroy it. We will only kill the leader. If the others are obedient, bring them back to this place. Su Ming no longer looked at Dao Zhong. Instead, he continued staring at the small white ball, as if he was incredibly interested in it. A blood-red glare shone in the gray Ikang clone's eyes. He did not speak, but instead took a step forward. When he arrived beside Dao Zhong, a chill ran down Dao Zhong's spine. He could sense the thick, killing intent from the gray figure, as well as a madness that shocked him. He quickly lowered his head and voiced his obedience. In his heart, he looked forward to what sort of expression his enemy would have when he saw him return. The second chapter is here. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Yen. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1267. Damn you, Zhou Tianfeng. This time, I'll make sure you die without a grave. Killing intent shone in Dao Zhong's eyes, but when he looked at Su Ming's gray clone by his side, his expression immediately turned into one of respect. Once he bowed deeply, a long arc flashed, and Su Ming's Ikang clone took a step forward. With Dao Zhong leading the way, he disappeared into the whirlwind. This thing is rather interesting. It's an insect egg, but it contains a hint of the power of the world. It doesn't seem like it's something from this world. Su Ming stared at the small white ball in his hand, then sent his Atman into it to observe it carefully. When his Atman fused into it, the small white ball immediately shuddered in his hand, as if it wanted to fight to leave, but Su Ming's hand was like a seal that kept it firmly sealed. Two long arcs charged through the galaxy of true Morning Dao world. Before them was a shattered continent in the whirlwind. It was not big, and it was in a shattered state. The center of it was cut off by the whirlwind. Master, this is the place. This is the small army that once belonged to Morning Dao sect. There are 3 almighties in it. Miao Feng pointed at the continent in the whirlwind and spoke respectfully to Su Ming's clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole. Su Ming's clone had a calm expression on his face. He cast a glance at the continent in the whirlwind, then walked out of the white ripple. He moved through the whirlwind and turned into a long arc that stirred up a loud bang that shook the sky and earth as he charged towards the continent. Miao Feng followed behind him. When he saw Su Ming's clone moving through the whirlwind, he became even more wary of Su Ming. Su Ming's clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole did not intend to hide his tracks. When the roars he stirred up reverberated in the air, they reached the continent. In just the span of a few breaths, a long arc flew up from the continent. Halt, intruder. This is Morning Dao sect's territory. All trespassers will be killed without mercy. The person who spoke was a middle-aged man with a hooked nose. He was dressed in a golden robe, and there was a hint of arrogance on his face. His voice spread in all directions and echoed in the universe. The power of those in Mastery Realm spread out from his body. His cultivation base was slightly mixed up, making it clear that it had not been long since he reached Mastery Realm. But his arrogance was much greater than that of many almighties. It was clear that this person hadn't become a great existence for long, but he still had a high and mighty aura about him. He wasn't like those who had fought on the battlefield for a long time. He looked arrogant, but he was actually quite vigilant inside. However, what answered him was a punch from Su Ming's clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole as the long arc descended. That punch was hundreds of thousands of feet away, but when it was thrown, it shook the heavens and the earth. It caused the sky to rumble, the earth to tremble, and the tornadoes in the area to pause for a moment. The moment the punch appeared, It turned into an illusion in the sky. It was so big that it covered an area of 1,000 feet. As it closed in with a loud bang, it swelled up to 10,000 feet and charged towards the arrogant middle-aged man. The middle-aged man's expression changed. He retreated without any hesitation. When he lifted his hands, he started chanting. He also formed a seal and tapped a few spots in front of him. Rays of light from treasures appeared on his body, and in the blink of an eye, they turned into a shield that was dozens of feet big in front of him. There were pictures of 2 pythons on it. At that moment, they looked as if they had come alive. They flew out and surrounded the middle-aged man, forming a whirlwind that crashed into the incoming punch. Booming sounds shook the sky and earth. The 2 pythons did not even have time to scream in pain before they were reduced to ashes. The shield also disappeared, allowing the punch to land on the middle-aged man's body. The man's face turned stark pale. Disbelief and terror appeared on his face. But no matter what, he was an almighty. He might not have been able to escape in time, but he bit his tongue and used the intense pain to stimulate his nascent divinity, causing his nascent divinity to tumble backwards and rush out of his body at the instant his physical body collided with the shadow of the punch. Boom! The middle-aged man's physical body turned into a bloody flower, but it was instantly devoured by the punch. With a loud bang, the punch landed on the ground. Once it let out a loud bang that shook the sky and earth, the ground trembled violently. Waves of air tumbled backwards madly like waves in the sea, causing the 10,000-something cultivators on the continent to be shocked. Most of them swiftly flew out and lifted their heads to look at the sky in fear. Su Ming's clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole appeared in the sky, and with a swing of his arm, he said flatly, "Ninth summit has descended. Those who obey will have no need to continue living." As the waves of air spread out, a huge pit appeared on the ground. That pit pierced through the continent, and the galaxy underneath could be seen. There was also a whirlwind moving through it, turning into a whirlwind vortex that pierced through the 2 sides of the galaxy. Fine cracks spread out from the edges of the pit with loud cracking sounds. The shock they created was enough to shock the hearts of all the cultivators in the area. 2 long arcs flew out from the ground at an incredible speed and stood in midair. With incredibly solemn expressions, they stared at Su Ming's clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole in the sky, as well as Meow Foam, who had just arrived behind him. "Sir, what is the meaning of this? Are you trying to take advantage of the fact that we have lost contact with Morning Dao sect and want to forcefully plunder our souls? Aren't you afraid that when the whirlwind disappears, Morning Dao sect's rage will descend upon us?" One of the 2 cultivators asked in a low voice. Morning Dao sect has already been reduced to ruins, and the Immortals Union has been reduced to nothingness. There is not a single cultivator left in all of true Morning Dao world. All of you are like duckweed without roots. Even if you can last for many years and wait for the whirlwind to disappear, what awaits you will not be the peace of the past, but a disaster that is 10,000 times more violent than the whirlwind. Join the 9th summit and become the master of Morning Dao world. This is your only choice, Su Ming's clone said flatly. Nonsense. Morning Dao sect is powerful, so how could it be destroyed in the whirlwind? What right do you have to, because I can move through the whirlwind, and because I can bring all of you through it? Su Ming said calmly. Do you agree or not? A brilliant light shone in his eyes, and he said his final sentence. A freezing, killing intent shone in the eyes of the person who had spoken previously, but at that moment, a cold sneer appeared at the corners of Su Ming's clone's lips. He lifted his right hand and seized the air in the direction of the deep pit he had created with his punch. Immediately, the vortex formed by the whirlwind shuddered, as if it was being sucked in by a continent. Under all the people's dumbfounded gazes, it charged towards Su Ming as if it had been broken. It surrounded him, and when Su Ming clenched his fist and punched it, booming sounds shook the universe. The vortex in the whirlwind crumbled, and as it tumbled backwards, it charged towards the whirlwind beyond the continent. Continuous booming sounds echoed in the air, and a gap that was 100,000 feet long appeared in the whirlwind. That gap had been blasted open by Su Ming's full-powered punch. The whirlwind in it shattered, and the power of the world tumbled backwards, forming a gap that immediately shocked the old man with killing intent in his eyes. The killing intent in his eyes instantly turned into shock. "You, what level of cultivation do you have?" Right when he said those words, the other old man beside him sighed in his heart. A resolute look appeared on his face, and he wrapped his fist in his palm before bowing deeply toward Su Ming. "I am willing to join Ninth Summit." As he spoke, the mark of his soul shone at the center of his brows. Once it appeared, it rushed out and charged toward Su Ming. Once it fused with him, he relaxed. Su Ming's strength had shocked him, but what shocked him even more was that with his power of Fate Realm, he could tell that the person in front of him was just a clone. Compared to the places where Su Ming's clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole went smoothly, the Ikang clone that contained Su Ming's destructive nature, which could not gather together a corporeal body, also had different endings because the two clones were given different natures when Su Ming sent them out. Those who obey will prosper, and those who go against will die. A hoarse voice tumbled out of the gray-haired but indistinct Ikang clone's mouth in a cold and dark manner. In his right hand was a bloody head. There was disbelief on that head's face, as if it could not believe that it would be killed even before it died. As he spoke, Su Ming's Ikang clone threw the head in his hand forward, and it landed in front of a tower formed by more than 1,000 heads piled together. Behind the tower of human heads were thousands of cultivators on the planet. Their faces were pale, especially the two burly men at the very front. Their hearts were trembling as they looked at two of the hundreds of heads on the tower. They were almighties who had been their companions just a moment ago. However, before the indistinct figure exuding a malicious presence, the two almighties could not even last for the time it takes for an incense stick to burn before they were killed. "Who are you?" One of the two men let out an almost crazed roar, but at the instant he did so, Su Ming's Ikang clone lowered his head. Blood red shone in his eyes, and his body swelled up with a bang. A huge tree that reached the sky appeared in the world, an endless amount of malice and an oppressive pressure that caused people to suffocate instantly enveloped the hearts of the thousands of cultivators on the planet. "You can call me Mo Su, and you can also call me Mo." Su Ming's Ikang clone said hoarsely. "Mo." The man shuddered and lowered his head in anguish. He wrapped his fist in his palm and bowed towards Su Ming's Ikang clone. The other almighty by his side was also forced to lower his head and worship him. As the two of them submitted, the thousands of cultivators knelt down and worshipped Mo Su without any hesitation. "We are willing to join Ninth Summit. Greetings, Sect Master Mo." As they bowed, the mark of a soul immediately appeared at the center of each cultivator's brows. They gathered together and charged towards Su Ming's Ikang clone. Once they fused into him, his body seemed to have gained slightly corporeal form. At the same time, the power of the laws of fate that Su Ming could see appeared on the thousands of cultivators. Soon after, the power of the laws of fate seemed to be resonating with Su Ming, and an indistinct law of fate that belonged to him appeared on his Ikang clone. He originally thought that he could write the 4th chapter, but he overestimated his body. Once he came back, he wrote the 3rd chapter twice out of the 4 days, then the 4th chapter on one day, and today he wrote the 3rd chapter again. He felt as if he was about to reach his limit. "But tomorrow I will write the 3rd chapter again. I beg for monthly votes. I beg for a guaranteed monthly vote for August. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.